My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute. I'd like to say how warmly we welcome all of you, in particular, of course, our distinguished guests and speakers, including, of course, Randy Yalos, president of Republicans Overseas, whose guests we were about a year ago in Paris. Today is the second of two conferences on the results of the recent US presidential election. The first was devoted to a wide range of political, social, cultural, and indeed, given that the new president is Donald Trump, personal issues thrown up by the election. And the conference turned out to be almost as colourful as the president himself, reflecting, I think, the fact that this election looks to be a very important transitional election in American politics at a time when the whole world is undergoing a series of transitions. This, of course, means that there is more flux, change, and the potential for change in the international system. It is already happening in the sense that we have two major wars going on at the moment, the first in Ukraine, following the Russian invasion, and the second in Gaza following the October the 7th, in which Hamas launched an attack on a murderous attack on the Israeli people. Today we're taking a closer look at one particular topic, which is, I think, the impact of the election and the return of Donald Trump to Europe and the major nations of the world with which the United States has had close relations, or, on the other hand, also some nations where the US relations have been warily antagonistic or suspicious. I just want to make 3 points before I invite our keynote speaker, David Lord Frost, to open the conference, and then following his address, Christoph Veres will be the moderator of the first panel. But I want just to make, as I say, 3 points. Since 1945, the first is that since 1945, the US has been a European power as well as a world superpower. Most Europeans found this very convenient most of the time. First of all, they were protected at low cost from the Soviet Union. Secondly, within NATO, the US military presence in Europe meant that no European power could go to war on any other Western European power. It simply wasn't going to be accepted by the NATO alliance, which was led by the United States. Not all Europeans liked that arrangement. Of course, it was for most of them convenient, but not all liked it. France only signed the Atlantic Charter in 1945, after the end of the war, and has always been a little restive with the notion of Atlanticism, which it has embraced, of course, most of the time, but rebelled against occasionally. The Americans always had the hope, particularly in later years, that Germany would be the basis of a German-US alliance within NATO, providing America with the stable economic leader for Europe that it wanted, just as it had Britain, so to speak, since 1949 as its ally on security and intelligence issues. But of course, the Germans themselves ceased to be quite so passionately pro-American as they had been for the first 20 years after the war, and they became, in some sense, a power in which the national identity was a combination of commerce, anti-Americanism, and a kind of semi-pacifism. And that has created problems for Europe as well, until the invasion of Ukraine. The first term of Donald Trump shook up the alliance between America and Europe. And the invasion of Ukraine restored that closeness, so to speak. But people forget what Trump actually did in the first term. First of all, it was his speech in Warsaw and his visit to NATO that essentially compelled the Europeans to realize that they would have to spend more on the collective defense. That would have to be done. And that was an extremely important change. The second thing I would say there is that if you look at the famous incident in which you've seen on video, in which a group of German diplomats are obviously quietly mocking among themselves the remarks that Trump is making to the UN at that time, what he's saying then is he's warning the Germans against their decisions to not spend enough on defense, but also to become too reliant on Russian energy. And that doesn't seem so foolish in the years since. So, if you remember what Trump actually did, including the fact that he was the first US president to arm Ukraine in its resistance to Russia, the picture we have of his return, drawn often by the media, doesn't seem quite so frightening. It probably has very considerable upsides too. Now, the second point I would make is the European media has always been an echo of the Washington press corps. Its coverage has always been somewhat biased to the left. That's been true in the last few years, not simply in Roman, but in italics. The coverage of American politics in most of the European media has been, quite frankly, a disgrace, which is not to say that it hasn't got some important points to make. But the fact is, most of us, and this was shown, most of us have a poor idea of the reality of the people and the issues in American politics. My example of that is the astonishment of the European media, including the British media, their astonishment that J.D. Vance, the vice presidential candidate, could apparently speak quite well, walk across the room without falling over, and in general was a competent, and in fact more than competent, orator and political analyst, as well as being a strong candidate. So it's time to remember that. The third is, yes, the transition in the world. US is failing and China rising. That is the overall broad picture we have in our minds. Well, we'll be talking about that issue in detail. I would say simply, that is not a reality, it is a prediction. It might continue, as early trends suggest, or it might halt and reverse. China is already having some problems economically, and we have an extremely acute observer of China at this conference. I'm looking forward to hearing him. And secondly, America has traditionally shown extraordinary recuperative powers and an ability to suddenly turn on a dime and begin moving in a progressive and powerful direction. I hope that is true this time, because, however, I prefer to deal in facts rather than predictions to prove my case. I can't actually claim it will happen, but I suggest that you consider it as a real possibility. That's the background to our situation. I am delighted to welcome as the keynote speaker David Frost, Lord Frost, who has had a distinguished first of all, a distinguished career in the civil service, not strictly a political career, but of course one dealing with politics, where he was the lead British negotiator on the Brexit, in the Brexit negotiations, which concluded, after a shaky start under other people, which concluded with not only Brexit, but also with the trade and cooperation agreement, which is the foundation, can be the foundation, and we'll see, for a better relationship between Europe and Britain. And he has since gone into party politics. He, as a member of the House of Lords, he is now one of the leading figures in the discussions within the Conservative Party over how it is going to react and build from the defeat it suffered. A defeat which I'm bound to quote something that Lord Frost said when he resigned from Boris Johnson's administration, that he was leaving with regret, but unfortunately he couldn't agree with the direction of travel which the government had embarked on, and where we see the destination that direction of travel led, we can applaud his foresight. So it's a great pleasure to invite him now.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, John. Thank you to the Danube Institute for having me here today and asking me to give your opening speech. The only thing I regret about being here today is that it deprives me of the opportunity to take part in something which we haven't seen in the UK for a long time, which is a demonstration of farmers against the government. There's going to be a big demonstration in London today. And I suspect the way things are going, there'll be another one. So you'll have to wait a bit for the pleasure of getting a photo of me on a tractor, which perhaps you can use next time in the photos. So to President Trump. President Trump's election, I think, is a turning point. And if his administration succeeds, it's going to bring in some very significant changes at the world level. And if it doesn't succeed, and that is, I guess, a possibility, it will be a decisive defeat, I think, for those of us who want to rebuild Western civilization on the basis of our history, traditions and strengths. And I do think conservative forces around the world need to see this and react accordingly. I don't think this is a moment to watch. I don't think it's a moment to sit things out. It's a moment to get involved. In short, and speaking as a conservative, this election is a moment of huge potential, I think. It is a massive opportunity for conservative movements across the world. The atmospherics are obviously very different to 2016. The new administration's team is much better prepared than last time, and the president obviously has the moral authority of having won the election decisively. And if his administration can make the progress in the directions he signalled, then I think this is going to be a really powerful, encouraging signal against decline and for conservatism and civilization more broadly. I think success for Trump also will start to overcome what is perhaps one of the left's biggest advantages in resisting this kind of change at the moment. And that is the sense that some problems are simply too big. The obstacles are too intractable, and they just must be lived with and can't be changed. So if the Trump administration is able to deliver real progress on, for example, deporting large numbers of illegal immigrants, genuinely closing the southern border, properly reversing the trend on so-called woke policymaking and diversity, or achieving serious large-scale cuts in government spending, this is going to have a really powerful real-world effect for the rest of us. And I guess in an ideal world, we'd see something like the mood of the 1980s, albeit on somewhat different ideas, but where the US is able once again to rally conservative forces across the world. I think this moment may be reinforced further if, as seems to be the intention, and as I certainly would hope, the administration puts out a lot of information, inside information perhaps, about the handling of the pandemic, gain-of-function experiments, vaccines, how the intelligence and domestic security agencies have conducted themselves, and so on. And this obviously has the potential to really discredit many of the old ways of doing things and make the mood of change a decisive break from the past much more clearly. So personally, I believe and I hope that this kind of moral effect, this galvanizing power for conservatives is going to be the biggest consequence in the long run at the global level of President Trump's re-election. But obviously there's much more to it. There are short-run shifts to which everybody's going to have to think about and respond. And as regards US foreign policy, which is of course the subject for today, the broad outlines of change seem clear to me. It looks like we are going to see a shift in relative US attention away from Europe and of course Ukraine, to some extent perhaps away from the Middle East too, though balanced in that case by stronger and maybe less conditional support for Israel, and towards a more determined effort to mobilize US strength to push back against China. And we'll see an effort to rely more on and ask more of local allies, with as a result a different pattern of friendships building up around the world, and not necessarily a particularly ideological one. And I suspect we will see increased suspicion of international organisations and treaties, withdrawal at least from the WHO and the Paris Climate Agreement firmly on the cards. Now, more important even than these shifts will, I suspect, nobody can be quite sure, be a change in the philosophy of foreign affairs. I mean, there will be not only, I think, a move towards foreign policy realism, but I hope also away from what I think of as existentialism, for want of a better word. And by this term, I mean the tendency the West has drifted into over the last couple of decades to see first best outcomes, often not always, but not always outcomes dictated by international conventions and courts, but to see these first best outcomes as the only acceptable outcomes to foreign policy problems. This tendency to be very black and white about possible solutions and to downplay the virtues of deal-making and pragmatism in a very complicated world. Now, this approach, which we've I guess, drifted into, is obviously in many ways a hangover from the unipolar moment of the 90s, from nation-building of the 2000s, when the US and the West, for a time, had at least a credible ability to impose solutions up to a point. But it's now well out of line with our real power in the world and our ability to solve every foreign policy problem in the way we want to. For example, one hears certain Western diplomats and commentators arguing that the only acceptable outcome to the Ukraine war is the recovery of all Ukraine's territory, and not only that, the collapse of the Putin regime, because, quote, Europe can't live with the threat of Russia. We hear the same argument about Iran. We can't live with Iran, and therefore the regime must be overthrown and a new world inaugurated. One must acknowledge, too, I think, that there's an element of this on the US right as regards China, a sense that a confrontation is coming and we must be ready for it. Now, I would guess, though, as I say, nothing can be certain, and will be interested to hear what others think, I would guess we'll see somewhat less of this hubris under the Trump administration. For all the professed hostility to China, in fact, China has been handled in quite a realist way, and I would expect this to continue under Trump, with an acceptance, obviously, China exists, is likely to be hostile to an extent, but yet the relationship must be managed. I suspect over time, though nothing is certain, that the relationship with Russia will shift in this way too. And perhaps once the immediate Middle East crisis is over, so too in that area as the Abraham Accords come back into play. Now, this approach doesn't mean a reluctance to make moral judgments. Indeed, it makes doing so all the more necessary. It doesn't mean accommodation to those regimes and their ends. It should mean more effective deterrence. And obviously there could easily be a violent edge at times to all the relationships I've mentioned. And one thinks, for example, in the past of the clash between the US and the Wagner Group in Syria in 2018, or obviously the killing of Soleimani in 2020, to see that there is precedent for this too. But it does mean, and as I keep saying, I'm guessing to some extent, it does mean that it's going to be about managing the big relationships in a more political way, based on clearer cost-benefit analyses, and in a way that's consistent with the political risks that the relationships involve. There's nothing particularly new in this. It's reminiscent of the Cold War, when policymakers made clear moral distinctions, saw themselves in competition, but still kept lines open, saw the risks of being purist, and recognised, perhaps more readily today, that the stakes could be extremely high if we got things wrong. Now, I'd expect personally to see somewhat more of this approach under President Trump, and if so, I think it's going to be difficult for many Europeans, and indeed Brits, and they'll come to us. It'll be difficult for many Europeans to accept. And many Europeans see themselves as the self-professed champions of the rules-based international order and international institutions. More than that, I think it's likely to expose the hollowness of much European and specifically EU foreign policy, and especially so on Ukraine. Europeans, after all, now face a difficult choice. If President Trump does make a serious effort to find a de-escalation, if not a permanent settlement. After all, most Europeans have insisted, or come to insist, that their own security, European security, depends on Ukraine winning the war outright. They might now face a choice between disavowing that view and instead supporting President Trump's efforts to find a way through, or alternative, rejecting those efforts and insisting on trying to support Ukraine on their own, a task of which they're clearly quite incapable without American support. My guess is that faced with this choice, some Europeans will go one way, some will go the other way, and the EU's policy will disintegrate rather into vacuousness and chaos. Indeed, I suspect that many Europeans privately want the war to end while being able to blame the US administration for a less than perfect settlement as a way out. I think this reveals to me a reluctance to engage with reality amongst European policymakers that is going to be a problem under the second Trump administration. It's going to be visible, obviously, on defence spending, which must be faced up to if Europe wants to maintain a meaningful alliance with the US and keep NATO viable. My impression is that many Europeans, even now, don't get the degree of frustration and anger that exists across the US at the degree of defence free riding in Europe. And here on this issue too, with a few exceptions, such as Poland, the EU seems to prefer to remain in its comfort zone of diverting existential problems into discussions of structures, as in the endless debate about European Security Defence Pact, who may fund it, and so on and so forth. Now, maybe in the end, something more organised will have to come in Europe. But the urgent need now is to increase defence spending and to do so rapidly. And it's not obvious that talking about new structures and arrangements is going to do anything but divert from that. It bears noting, I think, that Britain is no outlier here. We spend only slightly above 2% of GDP ourselves on defence, and there's a fair bit of creative accounting in there too. The government hasn't committed to a timetable for getting it to 2.5%. Yet at the same time, it has to be noted that the recent UK budget last month chose to increase taxes over the next 3 years by 2% of GDP, precisely the amount that would have taken our defence spending back up to Cold War levels. We chose to pour it into public services instead, and we too in the UK, like everyone else, have got to get real about this. Now, behind all this, to conclude, is a bigger decision for the UK itself. Now, my country is, of course, in a different position to others in Europe, in the sense that we do genuinely have a choice about how to react to the second Trump administration, and one that is not constrained by the organisation we're part of. Now, that choice is actually a pretty fundamental one, and I think this is a fundamental decision coming for the UK that's going to shape what we do for the next few years. One thing we could do is to tilt back towards Europe, to join or get close to whatever the emerging EU foreign and security organisations are. Join Europe, no doubt, in getting into a trade war in retaliation against Trump's trade tariffs, if that happens, and gradually shift towards greater economic alignment with the EU again. The other is to face the other way, to focus on getting a free trade agreement with the US, to deregulate and reform away from EU standards, and to invest more in a globally focused foreign and trade policy. And that's the logic of AUKUS, CANZUK, the CPTPP that we join in a month's time, and so on. Now, of course, that is consistent with having a good relationship with Europe. But it would be a recognition that the chances of a UK economic recovery wouldn't be enhanced by a closer relationship. Now, the current British kind of mood, I guess, in London appears to be one of so-called balancing between these two options. But it isn't really balancing. The UK, after all, already has a free trade agreement with the EU. As John mentioned, it's the one I negotiated. We don't have a trade agreement with the US. So a desire for the European option, at least as I see it, is actually a decision not to balance. It's a decision to maintain our current Europe-focused trade and economic policy. And for me, at least, politically and economically, that makes no sense. Now, we've got a very left-wing socialist government in the UK now, so what makes political and economic sense is not necessarily the first criterion. Its members do have, I think, quite a naive view of the EU, and I do fear they're going to use the second Trump administration to help them win the domestic argument for a proposed, as they call it, a reset with the EU. I personally believe that would be a huge mistake, but we've made many mistakes already, and it's not difficult to see the government adding another to that list. To conclude, the second Trump administration is a huge opportunity. Of course, there are risks. Of course, there will be things we don't foresee. Of course, there will be things the administration does which I and we won't agree with. That's the way things are. But the important thing is the big picture. Trump's victory is a victory for conservative forces across the world. It's a victory for foreign policy realism. It's a victory for getting our means in line with our resources and our aspirations. And as I said in opening, this could be a real turning point. We Europeans need to get real about it, get our foreign and defence policies working properly again. And if we can, I'm extremely excited about the next few years. They really could, they should be the herald of a transformation that's going to put the West in the best possible place for dealing with what will inevitably be a difficult, challenging, and often threatening world in the years to come. Let's work to make it so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Frost. Let's kick off with our first panel titled War and Peace, Ukraine, Israel and the Future of NATO. Among our speakers, we have Bassam Ait, founder and former director of the Palestinian Human Rights Monitoring Group. We have Michelle Watson, senior visiting fellow of the Danube Institute. And Doug Stokes, Professor of International Security and Strategy at the University at Exeter. I'm Kristóf Veres, I'm International Director of the Danube Institute, and I will be moderating this panel. So a little bit over a month ago, we organized a closed discussion in Berlin, where we had America First Republicans and CDU, CSU politicians from Germany. And when it was about a possible American foreign policy during a second Trump administration, which is now going to be a reality. And what was interesting is that the first 40 minutes of that discussion was dedicated to Germans asking whether Trump is going to quit NATO and how quickly he is going to quit NATO. I think this is a perfect example of the disconnect between what we can expect from a second Trump administration and what the mainstream media has been feeding us of what a catastrophe is going to be upon us if he is get elected. So I don't pretend that we have a magical crystal ball here with us and we will be able to actually say what Trump is going to do regarding the war in Ukraine or the future of NATO or the war in the Middle East. But I'm pretty sure that based on our experts' knowledge and the past experiences, as well as the personal picks that has already happened since his election, we can explore a few topics and reassure everyone that Trump is not going to quit NATO. So we are going to start with that, so everyone can go home and sleep calmly. But before we specifically start talking about the different aspects of Trump's foreign policy, I would like to ask Dr. Stokes to tell us a little bit about how the grand foreign policy strategy of the United States has changed in past years, independently of the election of Donald Trump.
Thank you very much. I think the main thing is that the cost-benefit analysis of American grand strategy has changed. I think as the international system has become more multipolar, the hegemonic costs of America's grand strategy have been raised. Globalization has seen the outsourcing of jobs, which has impacted upon ordinary people in the US and in Europe. And I think we're moving from a position of liberal hegemony, which has enormous costs to the United States, the US taxpayer. We heard David talk about, for example, NATO free riding. I think the costs of American liberal hegemony have changed. So I think essentially whenever we talk about the EU or any international organisation or supranational organisation, we should never lose the sight of the fact that the nation states within it have a cost-benefit calculation. If the costs of staying in or the cost of the hegemonic burden outweigh the benefits, it's in their national interest to essentially reassess that organisation. So I think the Ukraine crisis has really put the liberal hegemonic moment, the reassessment of that on steroids, because essentially America's strategic superintendence in Europe has become far more costly, i.e. a major peer competitor war, big war, interstate war. And so the Americans, for a long time, independently of Trump, wished to move away from Europe. They've got their eye on China, and they see that as the primary existential threat. They quite rightly say that NATO has cost the US a great deal, and they want to see European states do a lot more. So the main point I'd like to make is this. 2 points. First, everything's about a cost-benefit analysis, and you can sail out in the vapours of morality as long as you like, but ultimately it does come down to a cost-benefit analysis. And the Americans have made a cost-benefit analysis of liberal hegemony. They say the costs now outweigh the benefits, and in terms of supranationalism, international alliances, etc., especially the European states have to do more, and that frustration with the European states is independently of Trump. Read, for example, Bob Gates' resignation speech, Obama's secretary to NATO. Deep frustration with the Europeans free riding. Right. The second major point is this: the structural facts of international relations. We can talk about that a bit in the panel, or you can ask me the question on that or the audience. But I think the primary structural facts are the reassessment of the cost-benefit analysis of liberal hegemony. And the second one is the continued imbecility of European strategy. All this jibber-jabber about security and military, and it's just a talking shop. And so I won't go on too much longer, but I think the primary structural fact in European politics, in EU politics, has been the strategic myopia of Germany. If I see the EU as primarily as an institutionalized arrangement to constitutionalize German power. So the EU ultimately has been underpinned by German finance. But that is now changing as a result of Mama Merkel's energy policies. And what that's done to German industry, and they're missing out on the future of capitalism, i.e. AI, which requires huge amounts of energy. So Germany, Mama Merkel's energy policy essentially put the EU at the behest of Putin. And Trump said this, and he was castigated and laughed at, I think, as David also mentioned in his fantastic keynote speech. So essentially, the two big facts of world order now, the two big structural facts, independently of the agency of Trump and the personalities and ideology, the two big structural facts are the cost-benefit analysis of America's post-war and post-Cold War liberal hegemony. The costs to America now outweigh the benefits. So there's been a strategic ground street reassessment, which will have major implications for Europe and other states. And the second one is the deep structural transformation of Europe away from a German-centered financial and monetary union in the context of Germany's structural decline to a more geopolitical Europe, which will shift the balance of power away from Germany, which is in a kind of structural decline, demographically, economically. I don't say that with any glee, by the way, to a more northern, i.e. Scandinavian-centered geopolitical Europe, and also a more eastern Europe too, i.e. Poland. Poland will almost certainly become the major European land power in 5 to 10 years. It's bought incredible military kit from the South Koreans and from the Americans, and Poland, quite rightfully, doesn't want to ever feel that domination again from Russia, and so it's doing what it needs to do in its national interest. So liberal hegemony is dead, and the structure of European geopolitics is shifting inexorably north and east.
Thank you. My second question is for you, Michel. I'm very happy that you are here with us on this panel because Michel is aware of the dynamics of the Trump transition. Trump has nominated some controversial people to their cabinet posts, and before the transition is over and he becomes the president, these are like the best indicators to see in what general directions his foreign policy is headed. So, what can we deduce from these picks?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Christoph. Well, first of all, I'm going to focus this foreign policy opinions on NATO and the NATO policy perspective. I'm not a NATO expert. However, my background is in high-tech field, and the focus overlaps considerably with national security. So to your points, yes, he's made several controversial nominations, and but yet he is controversial, and I think he purposefully is provocative. So what does this mean? I think one of his appointments, Elise Stefanik, who is nominated to be the UN secretary, she historically, as a congresswoman, has been very supportive of Ukraine entering into NATO as soon as reasonably possible. Almost hours after her nomination as a UN secretary, she immediately walked that back, saying she no longer supports this. So I think this does give us, excuse me a second, I think this gives us a little more insight into what the Trump transition team is thinking with regard to Ukraine. But I do think, and I've heard some of this discussion, we've all heard Trump say, I'm going to end this war in Ukraine, within hours of me taking the presidency. But I think the question we all have is, yes, but on what terms? Is the term going to be favorable to Russia? More so, is it going to be a peace for land deal? One of the things, of course, is being discussed is a concession going to be given to Trump give to Putin, where there will be an agreement where Ukraine will not be entering into NATO for the foreseeable future. So will this is discussed as a very real possibility. And also something like the Austria deal in post-World War II, where the agreement was Austria will stay neutral, not in NATO and not in the Warsaw Pact headquarters. So things like this are being discussed. Also, and I agree completely with what Christoph said, that the U.S. is not going to pull out of NATO. And I don't think serious people are giving that any serious consideration. But what we are seeing a lot of discussion around is the U.S. will not be leading as much, and Trump and the administration will be looking for the European countries, of course, to take more and more of a leadership role. And what does that mean? What does that look like? One of the things that I focus on is the private sector. The private sector obviously provides a lot of the weaponry and systems to NATO and to Ukraine. So right now, the big high-tech companies and the big defense contractors are providing NATO weapons to NATO through the Pentagon. Same thing through for the Ukraine war. The big five. The big five defense contractors, of course, but also high-tech companies like Amazon and Microsoft, Google, Starlink, significantly. All of these high-tech companies are providing a lot of cybersecurity support, communication support, and just high-tech support generally across the board to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. But these companies are providing the support through the Pentagon. What that means is that I think we're going to see Trump make the decision through the Pentagon that there's going to be less private sector involvement. And that's another way that U.S. will, let's say, lead less in NATO and in Ukraine going forward.
Thank you. Michel mentioned Ellie Stefanik, so now I would like to go over to Bassem, because Ellie Stefanik is also, her pick is very, very significant when it comes to Israel. So what does Israel expect from the new Trump administration? I mean, 4 days ago, I was at the Shuk in Jerusalem, and we were just randomly asking young people there on Thursday evening about what do you prefer, Trump or Kamala? Well, everyone can imagine that everyone said Trump. So why is that?
Because he's a very crazy guy. And we like crazy people here. I think that there is a huge expectation right now from Israel towards the Trump administration. A lot of issues already has been presented on the table, and Israel is just waiting for each moment to see when Trump is entering the White House. Trump also very care about what's going on in the Middle East right now. And probably he's talking much more about Lebanon and Israel rather than about Gaza and Israel. Because Lebanon and Israel probably can reach a kind of, let's say, a conclusion or a kind of an agreement. But Israel will never, ever be able to reach such kind of agreement with Hamas. So this is also another dilemma, how Trump is going to deal with the Gaza Strip. Because what we heard from the current administration right now, that the problem of Gaza is the humanitarian aid. It's not. It's not the humanitarian aid. It's much more the hostages. Much more the hostages. You want humanitarian aid? Release the hostages. What the Hamas want to achieve by holding the hostages over than 400 days? What exactly they want to achieve? In the meantime, what the Palestinians really benefiting from holding those hostages for over than 400 days? What the Palestinians are really benefiting from that? I think that this is what the international community should have to focus on, is the hostages and the humanitarian aid. But right now, everyone is talking about the humanitarian aid. We saw the Biden administration, they ban the the munition to Israel because of the humanitarian aid. And that's exactly the first issue that Trump is going to do, is how to release the munition as soon as possible. This is the first important issue. Now, you have some other issues here. You have the issue of UNRWA as an example. UNRWA also became a disaster here in the Middle East, and UNRWA also became a part of the conflict rather than it is a part of the solution, unfortunately. And I think that this is something that Israel should have to deal with it via the Trump administration. On the other side, what Israel also want to achieve after the war in the Gaza Strip, I think that Israel didn't talk about it. I think that Israel is in a big dilemma about this issue. Who is going to run Gaza? Is Gaza going to be a part of the occupied territories? Will Israel going to continue its occupation to the Gaza Strip? Is Israel really planning to return back the settlements in the Gaza Strip? These are also big issues that I think that the Israeli government should have to sit by itself and to start dealing how we are really going to solve it. Thank you.
So you are saying that under this new Trump administration, Israel is going to get like a quasi free hand to reshape its neighborhood?
I couldn't say a free hand, because free hand is very dangerous. Because we have an issue right now, which is the right wing of the current Israeli government talking about, is the West Bank and how to annex the West Bank to Israel. This is very dangerous. Israel is going to raise it in front of Trump. I'm not quite sure that Trump is going to give his blessing. Because while you have still countries in the international community who believes in the two-state solution, so to annex the West Bank to Israel, that will kill the two-state solution. So I'm not quite sure that Trump is really going to give his blessing, very soon towards the West Bank and to annex it to Israel.
Doug, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm not. The only thing I would say to that, I think Israel's dilemma obviously is two strategic doctrines. It has many strategic doctrines, but it always has to win every war, because if it doesn't, it's not going to be good. And it has to also emerge from that war with a moral position. It has to be a moral actor. So I suspect that would put a massive brake on any kind of more radical moves from the Israeli right to annex anything. I think that Israel now has to somehow retain the moral high ground here, post-war. And I would also say, again, I'm going out on a limb here, but one would think that one of the ways you could do the Gaza Strip, quote unquote, is to capitalize, when Trump's in, is to capitalize on the momentum of the Abraham Accords. And one presumes it's the Abraham Accords are the structural conditions of possibility that have not led to a wider regional major conflict, i.e., so essentially the Gulf states are aligned with Israel. They look at the future and they see where the future's at. Post-fossil fuels, economic interdependence with Israel, high-tech, military security, intelligence cooperation, and also various land borders, energy borders, etc. So they know which way the wind's blowing, and I think Trump will put that on steroids, hopefully. And I think that, and so what we're seeing now, the structural conditions of possibility in the Middle East are really the Abraham Accords, which is what the whole point of Sinwar's miscalculation was, to destroy those things. Apparently the Iranians didn't know about the October the 7th, so he's brought destruction down on Iran's proxy meat shield strategy, Hezbollah, which is getting decimated, and Hamas, which is decimated. So I think once Trump's in, one hopes for peace, and you can capitalize on the Abraham Accords, and one presumes, hopefully, that there would be some sort of multinational reconstruction effort, ideally led to some extent by the Gulf states in the Gaza Strip, to produce dignity and peace in that part of the world. But I don't see any momentum strategically. I don't think it makes any sense for any kind of reoccupation of the West Bank. But I could be wrong.
So it's specifically the annexation of the West Bank that would be something that would prevent to sign more Abraham Accords, right?
Israel's major dilemma now is to somehow repair its identity and its reputation in the international community. It's a pariah, unjustly so. Major efforts to castigate it internationally, right? So it has to repair that. And I think any major move to reoccupy the West Bank would fundamentally damage that. It's in Israel's strategic interests to somehow redo its soft power. So to do that, that's a red line for the international community, and it wouldn't be in Israel's national interest to do that, I don't think. Even though you may have elements of the Israeli right that are pushing for that. And I think that would also be contained by even the Trump administration wouldn't because again the cost to the Trump administration would be huge. So I don't see that having momentum. I think it's not in Israel's interest objectively in any single sense.
So let's jump a little bit back to Ukraine, and then I would like to go back to the Middle East too. Back to Trump's cabinet picks. Usually a dichotomy. There is a dichotomy in the mainstream press between Ukraine hawks and Ukraine skeptics, with Trump being described as a Ukraine skeptic, and usually people say, "Oh, Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine." That's obvious for everyone, but that equals completely cutting aid to Ukraine. I'm asking this because. For two reasons. One, there was a lot of confusion here in Central Europe when Speaker Mike Johnson in April basically pushed through another aid package for Ukraine and for Israel. Of course, there was a little bit of confusion of why someone who personally voted against a Ukraine aid package before, as a speaker, pushed something similar through. Now, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is someone who, first of all, wrote an op-ed a year ago saying how important it is to support Ukraine, but at the same time voted no against the latest Ukraine aid package. So how does that work? How does that work? Questions for both of you.
In terms of our new Secretary of State, I think that there's going to continue to be a lot of support for Ukraine in ways that may not be quite so much direct weapon support. And one of the things, as I alluded to, is the technology support, and SpaceX company Starlink was providing from the very next day after the Russian attack, providing all of the comms with Viasat being taken out, all the communications, all the Wi-Fi, all not just for the citizens. There's humanitarian aid that they were providing comms for. Also to the military, the drone targeting obviously has to have communication. So Starlink is providing all of that. I think we will continue to see the support of U.S. technology companies to support Ukraine. And less of the defense contractors supporting weaponry. So I think maybe that's how they split it. Yes, still support, but not as much direct weaponry support.
Yeah, I think that the America's not going to give up on NATO. I think what we'll see is an American lighter NATO in Europe. again, I go back to the point I made earlier on. It's nothing specific to the Trump administration. I think Trump personally his main thing is he just hates to feel getting ripped off. And obviously he feels ripped off by the Europeans. I mean, essentially, the EEC, EU, and European supranationalization has rested upon essentially a massive subsidy by American taxpayers vis-à-vis the defence. The French and the Germans and others, the UK as well, could build a social welfare states, etc., because they didn't have to divert huge amounts to military spending. So essentially you've got American taxpayers subsidising European security. And if you look at NATO was about containing the Soviet Union, obviously, and then it's also to some extent about containing Russia, but it was also about pacifying peer strategic competition amongst the Europeans themselves. It solved a lot of collective action problems for European security, and that worked in America's national security interest on many levels, and also its economic interests. Just look at FDI, foreign direct investment between the US and Europe. It's a no-brainer. So the US has massive strategic interests in European security still, independently of what Trump may or choose to do. I think at max you're looking at what we might call a dormant NATO structure where the US continues to underwrite its military, its nuclear guarantee, naval support, etc. But the main interesting quote unquote thing in terms of European security is what this does in relation to pan-European security cooperation. I go back to my point earlier on. You've seen this historic casting of the EU and Europe as what they call normative Europe, a normative moral actor. And they looked at the Americans as gauche and cowboyish and they're terribly, like that. But essentially they're free-ridden, completely free-ridden on America's security guarantees. So now I'm afraid that the wave is washing out in that because America quite rightfully wants to concentrate on China, which is the existential threat. Russia has nuclear weapons, but in terms of existential stakes, in terms of great power politics, it's really not that big a deal. I hate to say it. I can go into the details why, but it's not that big a deal. So that's what's going on there. So I think that the interesting thing to watch for the future as a future trend is what an American-like European security neighbourhood would look like and do to pan-European security cooperation. You've had all this jibber-jabber about, the common European security framework, PESCO, but you look at the data on that, it's non-existent. And then I go back to my point about cost-benefit analysis and also institutions. Every state, ultimately, when it comes together in an alliance structure, has to calculate its national interests vis-à-vis what that alliance wishes to do. And you've got this on steroids in the European context. You've got various great powers, proud powers, France, Germany, etc. Are you really going to see German generals ordering French army divisions around? And that's always the problem, i.e. the overdetermination of the national interest in relation to supranational initiatives. You're always going to get that. So I think that will be the interesting one to watch, what the American-like NATO security architecture does to European politics in the context of the overdetermination of the independent national interests in relation to greater supranational security cooperation and in the context of the political economy of the EU going down the tubes because of various reasons, more of a socialist kind of orientation, a very, very strange energy policy at the heart of the EU machinery, i.e. Germany. What it's done makes no sense whatsoever. A massive gamble on Russian energy, that did not pay off. A massive gamble on denuclearization. And where your energy goes, so does your industry go, and so does the quality of your life go. So we live in interesting times.
Michelle, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, two things. First of all, I definitely agree. I think Trump wants to spend more money on China. I think it is an existential threat, the number one existential threat to our country. So the pivot towards building up our military in the Pacific, I think, is a definite goal and I think that will happen. Number two is that there are some NATO initiatives that under Stoltenberg he really spearheaded that encourage more private sector investment from EU countries. For example, there's something called DIANA, which is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic. And it's like startup incubator, but focusing on EU countries. There's a lot of US companies already that are doing this. So this was to encourage more private sector companies to be involved in NATO defense by European countries. So that's a very popular initiative and something that Trump said, yes, this is good, let's have more of this. So then there's another one called the Defense Production Action Plan. Again, this is an initiative that Stoltenberg spearheaded to encourage more partnership with the private sector. Again, so that NATO is looking to capabilities from private sector companies and less from governments. But again, this focused on private sector companies in Europe. Again, pivoting away from the reliance on U.S. companies as well as U.S. government. So I think these two initiatives we're going to see more accelerated in Europe, and the Trump team certainly encourages this.
So thank you. Final question for Bassam. I'm among those fortunate people who were in a shelter during an air raid in Odessa, Ukraine, and a couple of months later in Jerusalem, Israel. A lot of things were different. The kind of people that were seeking shelter, the sound of the sirens was different, which was surprising for me. The protocol was different too. One thing was the same: the Iranian drones and the Iranian missiles. So my question is, since Ukraine and Israel, in a way, faces the same adversaries, in a way, is there a hope, or not even a hope, but does Israel have anything to gain to have a closer cooperation or any kind of cooperation with Ukraine? Or now with the Trump administration, the two countries' fates are going to run on separate tracks?
Yeah, the relationship between Israel and Ukraine is not really the most important issue right now. We have much more important things to deal with. As you mentioned, the Iranian. Where Iran is going to lead the Middle East, to where? What exactly the Iranians want to approach here? Are the Iranians going to change their foreign policy towards the Middle East because Trump has been elected? Or it's going to remain in the same level? I think that there are a lot of issues right now, and this is one of the most important things that Israel is going to focus on it during the Trump administration, is how to limit the activities of the Iranians in the Middle East. How we can stop providing munitions to Lebanon from Iran through Syria. This is, let's say, a huge thing that both sides, the Israelis and the Americans, should have to sit together and to study it very well and to try to find ways how we can limit the activities of the Hezbollah in Lebanon, also probably the Houthis in Yemen, also the Hamas in Gaza, also the others in Iraq. So it's a big deal here to start working very seriously and very carefully how to get those terrorist organizations out of the Middle East. I think that that terror is growing in the Middle East right now, and this is probably one of the most important agenda that Trump administration should have to start working on.
Doug, anything to add? And one thing about Iran. With Trump, we've seen a campaign of maximum pressure, but he's also a deal maker.
Yeah, I think that my assessment is I think Hamas is done, and it will be done. The main thing, Hamas and Hezbollah really were a broader part of the Iranian proxy strategy, and they've been decimated. The Pager strike was that will be looked back on in history as an incredible operation. As far as I can tell, Hezbollah have been really minced up badly as well and decimated, and I think that will continue. Iran's in a very sort of strange place now. What was very interesting to me was that when Israel whacked back for the hypersonic missile attack, it didn't hit obvious targets. It largely hit symbolic targets, i.e. the S-300s that Russia had put in there, the anti-air missile stuff. And what Israel was saying to the Iranian leadership was, we can take out your anti-air missiles, and we will dominate the skies. We can decimate you. And Iran has major strategic vulnerabilities, not least of which about 90% of Iranian oil comes out of a little island called Kursk, and that could be minced up pretty quick. So basically, within a couple of hours, you could ultimately take out a huge chunk of Iranians' oil outputs. The nuclear thing is much, much harder. That's another story. But so Israel and or the US, or combined, could decimate Iran very, very easily. And the Iranian leadership know that. One suspects that the key thing that they have to do is Iran has kind of signaled that if that happened, they may fire onto Saudi Arabia, and they have to control, obviously, oil supplies and the potential for inflation. So I suspect what happened, Biden said to the Israelis, under no circumstances can you whack Kursk and or the Iranian facilities. So they had to carry out a symbolic attack. The Israelis once Trump's in, will have much more latitude in terms of what they choose to do, but one presumes that they're going to have to line up the Gulf states as well, because they could get whacked by the Iranians, and that would cause a major issue in terms of regional conflict, but also in terms of major importation of inflation as a result of what it would do to the oil prices. So I think, but then again, going back to this, the Abraham Accords are a really interesting beam of great light in the Middle East in terms of its potential to signal the way to a greater regional reordering of the region. My personal opinion is I think Iran's in a really, really, really tight spot. Sinwar, Hamas guy, he dragged the whole Iranian strategy into hell. Terrible miscalculation on his part. So I think Iran's in a very tight strategic space now. Hezbollah, the decapitation strategy was a work of genius, and so I really think they've been rolled back. One hopes for peace, but I think once Trump's in, I think that you will see more latitude on the part of the Israelis in terms of what they can do to Iran.
So at this point, I will have to open up the questions to the audience. So I ask everyone to ask questions, not monologues, and certainly not political statements, please. And I ask everyone to introduce themselves when they stand up. Thank you. So the gentleman to the right.
You said to stand up, so I'm standing up. My name is Harry Gibbs. I'm a student at Corvinus University studying international relations. And this morning I read something on the State Department USA website, I believe, about AUKUS doing hypersonic missile testing in 2028, which is a little bit behind the Russians who are already there. And then we look at Elon Musk landing rockets into cranes. So I'm just wondering if there's a framework whereby mentioned NATO is going to use these new things which Stoltenberg put in place, whether but will Elon Musk's technology be weaponized, and is there a better way of having a state procurement versus private sector development model? Thank you.
I do think that Elon Musk's technologies can be weaponized. I do think that he will resist this. We saw this demonstrated in Starlink when they were using it to target certain Russian subs, and Elon prevented the Ukrainians from actually utilizing Starlink in one particular provoking situation. So I do think that the technology obviously exists for it to be weaponized. Elon Musk is going to push back on it. So I think we're going to see, I think if private sector companies have a say-so in it, the less likely it will happen. But what is the Pentagon under a Trump administration? What are they going to have the power to do? I can only speculate. I think that we just have to wait and see.
Just very briefly, so the West and the Americans in particular already possess lots of hypersonic missiles. I think the AUKUS thing is mainly about just greater defence cooperation between the AUKUS partners, i.e. the UK, Australia, and the US. And the AUKUS primary strategic framework for that really is ultimately the naval containment of China. So the pillar one of AUKUS is about the supply of nuclear submarines to Australia. It means they can sail much further and have and ultimately stop Chinese Navy from going too close to Australia or interdicting its supply lines. Pillar 2, which is actually a much more exciting aspect of AUKUS, is much more about defence cooperation between those three partners. Interestingly, we'll see what happens with Trump, because the US doesn't possess, is a bit wary in terms of sharing its nuclear sub-technology with the Australians, although they enjoy a very, very close partnership. So we'll see what happens with the AUKUS framework under Trump. I hope he sticks with it. It's a fantastic framework for cooperation between Anglophone nations and is a very important one.
Next question.
Yes. Randy Allos, President of Republicans Overseas. I have a question back to Christopher, what you were asking about the Ukraine-Israel relationship, and maybe more looking at Russia and Israel. No, we don't talk about that quite often. And I think that's something we should maybe, at least that's my question to you. I believe that between Israel has refrained from giving any military aid to Ukraine because of its relationship. And that's my question to you, to what your vision on is that because there's also a close relationship between Israel and Russia. Russia has given its airspace to cross into Syria. Whatever happens in Syria is under Russian control. They also have a policy, and in my view, is that Iran is under containment by Russia too, even though it's an ally. They don't want, because they have issues of radical Islam also within Russia, they want to contain, I believe, also the Iranian regime to a certain extent, and they use Israel as somewhat of a check on that, and they allow certain activities to occur with the silent approval, of course, of the Putin administration going forth. So I wanted to know what's your view on that. And we have seen that the Russians didn't give high-tech technology, whether it's high military aviation and new plane technology, to the Iranians, and certain types of advanced offensive technology to the Iranians against Israel, which is an aspect which I wanted you to maybe give your view between what is the three-way situation between Israel, Russia, and Iran. That's because we don't talk about it often, and I think it's interesting if we can have your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Sam, maybe?
Yeah, probably we didn't mention this issue because the relationship is so strong between Israel and Russia. And I think that the security information exchange right now between Israel and Russia on what's going on in Syria, this is very strong, and Israel is also appreciated from the Russian point of view. I think that Russia also, in the meantime, want to try to put its foot in the Middle East right now, especially in the Lebanese-Israeli war. We know that Putin sent a delegation to Tel Aviv with a peace plan suggestion to Netanyahu, and he even tried, to ask Netanyahu to accept it. And but we have here another fight, the fight between Russia and the United States. Now we are friends for both, but we don't want to fight for both in the meantime. So I think that the Americans will never allow the Russian to take part in what's going on right now in the Middle East. And I think that Israel, in the meantime, not expecting any kind of positive things from the relationship between Russia and Iran. Russia is not going to help Israel to solve its own problem with Iran, that's for sure. On the other side, I don't think that Putin try even to highlight this issue, the Iranian-Israeli issue. So right now, looks like Israel is very satisfied from its relationship with Russia, and God knows what might be happened after Trump will come back to the White House and which kind of policy Trump is going to use against the Iranians. And he looks like also became very friendly to Russia and to Putin in the meantime. Yeah.
Just one follow-up on that. Wouldn't you still say that since October 7, the relationship between, obviously Israel has to be on good terms with Russia, right? But that relationship became strained since October 7. Just one example off the top of my head. The Iranian disinformation campaigns after following October 7 were amplified by the Russian disinformation machine.
I think that the Iranians still denying the October 7th. They denied that. They never ever admitted. On the other side, this is not the issue right now, the October 7th, between the Russians and the Iranians. I think that Russia is very aware about what's really happened on October 7th in the south of Israel. I think that Russia is not trying even to raise any kind of argument, let's say, about what's happened on October 7th. And I don't think that the relationship between Russia and Iran is going to be harassed because of what's happened on the October 7th in Israel. There are several issues, and each country knows exactly how to deal with its own political interest. Yeah.
Yes?
Thank you. Giray Sadık, Ludovica Fellow. Follow up with the previous question, which I think it's very timely, and your question, and perhaps to Doug also related with your earlier remarks. I agree with your assessments, but in terms of looking forward, how likely do you see the de-escalation in Ukraine with the escalation risk in the Middle East? Because also for the reasons that Michel pointed out, that with the defense industry production and so on, those are limitations. Everyone is talking about Asia pivot and disengagement from Europe, but how about de-escalation in Ukraine and risk of escalation in the Middle East? Thank you.
I think that my assessment of that would be, I don't buy the argument that this so-called authoritarian axis is that big a deal. I know that sounds a bit odd, but if you look at the hard data on a lot of it, it's kind of a marriage of convenience. They often don't like each other. There's cross-cutting national interests. We just had from Basim about the cross-cutting interest between Israel and Russia and what that means in relation to Iran. Israel's whack post-hypersonic missile, Iran's hypersonic missile. Israel whacked out most of the S-300s, which is like the big thing that Russia was giving to the Iranians to create a kind of safe and sanitized airspace against Israel and or America. They've mostly been destroyed with impunity. So Iran's in a very, very vulnerable position. I already spoke about some of the major strategic vulnerabilities of Iran. 90% of its oil goes out of Kursk. That can be whacked very easily. So it has lots of vulnerabilities. Russia, if you look at data on the Russian economy, about 40% of it now is war-dedicated GDP-wise. That's going to be hard to dial back from. But I think that this so-called axis, and that's before we even get to China, I want to save a little bit juice for this afternoon's panel on China, so I don't want to give too much away if you hopefully you will stay for that. But again, if we look at Germany and its demography and its economics, we could see that the same in China on steroids. So that's an interesting thing, but I don't want to give too much away. So please stay around for this afternoon. So I don't think that the so-called authoritarian axis has that much mojo to it. I think it's largely marriages of convenience, quite dysfunctional economies that can be smashed even more. And I hate to use those brutal terms, but that's the truth of it. I think that post-Ukraine, I think a Ukraine deal will definitely be done. I don't think it'd be a million miles away from the 2022 deal. I think my perception on, I'm not a mystic, maybe I can't stare into Trump's mind, but one presumes he will make an offer. He'll lose patience with Russia quite quick if Russia doesn't bite his hand off. And I think that even on Ukraine, I think what you'd see there would likely be a multinational force inserted there, Western European nations. Even it won't be part of NATO or be kicked into the long grass long term. But even, it's my hope, I've said this before publicly on a number of occasions, post-Putin and or in an ideal world, there would be some degree of reformation of the European security architecture, NATO security architecture, that has a dignified incorporation or massive dialogue and a post-NATO security architecture that incorporates Russia. Whatever you think about Russia, it is a fact. It's a fact. It's not going to go anywhere, and it has nuclear missiles, and it can spoil. And as long as European security is dominated by the Russia question, we should put that to bed. And Russia has it does have legitimate national security interests, notwithstanding Ukraine and the aggression in Ukraine, obviously, but it has national security interests, and it should be respected. And I think my perception on Ukraine and in Russian foreign policy discourse in general is as much driven, if not more driven, by a desire for status and to be respected as it is about national security interests. So I think that we should have some degree of mature dialogue about a post-NATO security architecture that incorporates Russia or has that dialogue with Russia, or at least a mature dialogue, in a way that resets European security. I don't want the UK and the whole of Europe to sort of be here in 20 years' time still banging on about Russia and proxy wars and goodness knows what. That's not in anybody's interest, Russia's interest or NATO's interest. So we should put that to bed. We should have maturity, the new Yalta conference, big dialogue, do something, along those kinds of lines. We don't need this stuff. And then in a kind of grand chessboard type way, if you can do that with Russia, and if we accept that China is the key existential threat for the Americans or for the world order, although we can debate that this afternoon, then you have a 2,500-mile land corridor with Russia right across China. And goes back to my original point, which is the so-called authoritarian axis is fragile. Russia does not want to be a supplicant of China. And if you look at the history of China and Russia, it's interesting, put it like that. So we'll see where it all goes. I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
We have time for one final question.
Rodrigo from Freelancing. I would like to ask you just a quick final question, because we often hear people saying about nuclear war, how possible it is. Do you think it's a hoax, or it's a real possibility of nuclear war if we don't de-escalate the conflicts?
I think that, I don't want to over-dominate. If anyone wants to come in on this, just please shout, please. I think that on the nuclear issue, I think what you'd see, nuclear strategy is about escalation dominance. So it's not like you're going to go large and a nuke's going to land on London straight away like that. Essentially, what it's about escalation dominance and signalling risk. So I think even in the worst case scenario, and apparently got quite close in 2022, by the way, with the Russians, I think what you'd see would be a tactical nuke, i.e. not a strategic nuke, a tactical nuke used in somewhere that wouldn't completely destroy, too much, and it would be a signal. So even the worst case scenario, I think you'd see that. I think that, but to do that though, it crosses a threshold. And I think the Chinese have said to the Russians, in no circumstance will you use nuclear weapons. So I think that there are lots of constraints on it. And even in the worst case scenario, you'd likely see a tactical nuke, as horrible and as awful as that would be. That's what you'd likely see. So, and it's a nuclear strategy is all about escalation dominance, and that's so. There's lots of stuff that would mitigate that. I'll just stop. Yeah.
Michelle?
Just one quick point. I was encouraged to see that there was an agreement between Biden and President Xi that China and the U.S. have agreed that they will not utilize AI in the weapons control, command and control for nuclear weapons. So that eliminates, I think, one concern that we had. Having AI in charge of command and control of nuclear weapons is a big concern.
You mentioned conflicts plural. So a final question on that side for Bassem. With Iran weakened, its axis of resistance or forward defense, Hamas and Hezbollah decimated. Its S-300 air defense is destroyed. Should we fear that the Iranian regime would feel that their only real defense would be a dash to the bomb and go nuclear?
See, nobody knows exactly what is in the mind of the Iranians right now towards the future. Right now, they are feeling so comfortable with their own partners, let's say, in the Middle East. And right now, they are very satisfied how their partners in the Middle East really continue disturbing the internal Israeli security. That's the main aim of the Iranians right now. So while those partners will continue disturbing the internal Israeli security, so the Iranians are very satisfied. They will continue, of course, sending their munition and sending their billions of dollars. Now, what will happen later? Let's see if Israel will be able to get rid from the Hamas in Gaza, if Israel will be able to destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is something very difficult right now to think about it. But in the meantime, if those two big terrorist organizations will be trashed from the map, I believe that the Iranians probably will change their own policy, or they will start working how to find out new terrorist partners in the Middle East.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That concludes our first panel. And Since we were talking about Israeli security, I also have to make a security announcement. In the coffee break that we are going to have now, I ask each of our guests to put their backpacks into the cloakroom. So from the second panel, no backpacks will be allowed here in the auditorium. Now we are going to break for a coffee, 10 minutes, and our next panel is going to start at 10:45. So thank you very much for coming, and see everyone in 10 minutes. Our second panel is going to focus on economics, trade, and energy relations, titled Towards a Sustainable Transatlantic Partnership. The panel is going to be moderated by our own Director of Research, Callum T.M. Nicholson, and he is going to introduce the panelists for you. Callum, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christoph. Everyone can hear me okay? Great. Okay, good. Oh, that's better. Right. So thanks a lot for the invitation, Christoph, to moderate the panel. So as you said, the panel topic today is economics, trade, and energy relations towards a sustainable transatlantic partnership. And today we're very privileged to have four great speakers with us. David Goldman, Deputy Editor at the Asia Times. Randy Yellas, who's a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. Jeff Balabon, who's a Senior Counsel for International and Government Affairs at the American Center for Law and Justice. And Kacper Kitta, expert at the Warsaw Institute and a former assistant to the Polish Deputy Foreign Minister. So we've got about 70 minutes, 65 minutes thereabouts. We're not going to have opening statements so much, but I've got a few questions for them, and then we can open it up to the audience. But the first question, obviously the title of the conference is Trump 2.0. And first I'm wondering what continuity will there be with Trump 2.0 with Trump 1.0 to Trump 2.0? To what extent will Trump simply continue the policies that he was undertaking 4 years ago? David.
Yes, well, the centerpiece of Trump's energy policy with respect to Germany in the first administration was to persuade the Germans to buy American liquefied natural gas instead of Russian natural gas. Given his emphasis on drilling hydrocarbons in the United States, I'm sure he'll return to that, but he'll return under very different circumstances. If you look at the chart, German industrial users are now paying roughly 40 euro cents a kilowatt hour for electricity, which is just about the highest in Europe, actually. I think Britain is slightly higher. That's opposed to 7 cents in the United States. Hungary, thanks to its excellent relations with Turkey and Azerbaijan, is much below that. If we could get to the next slide. The result of this is a catastrophe for German industry and indirectly an enormous benefit to China. German industrial production is down about 10% from the peak, and for energy-intensive industries, it's down about 20% for the peak. This is an existential issue for Germany, and it's being solved, or not solved, adapted to in the short term by an exodus of German capital to China. So although foreign direct investment in China generally, particularly from the US, has evaporated, German foreign direct investment in China is at a record, the 10 billion euro a year range. BASF, which of course is a very energy-intensive chemical company, now has more employees in China than it does in Germany. The German Auto Association projects a loss of 200,000 jobs out of about 450,000, which is, for Germany, a catastrophic event. But there's a corresponding shift towards China. That's one aspect of it. The other side of it is Germany. It was commented in the first panel that Germany's deindustrialization makes it less important in the European Union. One can look at that inside out, as it were, that its industrial problems make the European Union much less interesting to Germany. The Germans I talked to point out that Turkey now makes more automobiles than France, and everything to the west of them is something of a drag and a burden, not much use to them, whereas Turkey and Central Asia are of great long-term interest. In a world of demographic decline, Central Asia's working-age population is projected to double in the course of the century. China has been all over that. Its exports to Central Asia tripled just in the last 3 or 4 years. It's building connectivity, telecommunications, pipelines, ports, railroads, and so forth. And a combination of Russian education and Chinese infrastructure are making Central Asia one of the potentially great growth zones in the world. That, by the way, is something which Hungary has been well in advance of the rest of Europe in recognizing. Hungary is the only European member of the Organization of Turkic Peoples. Prime Minister Orban received an award from this organization at their summit a couple of weeks ago. So the result of the Ukraine war and its impact on energy prices, the end of cheap Russian natural gas, pushes Germany and everything to the east of it towards a long-term reorientation towards China and the greater Chinese economic sphere in Eurasia. The Belt and Road Initiative, the New Silk Road, is most focused on connectivity in Central Asia. This population, this very unique area of population growth can either become a source of instability, indeed jihad, with a spillover from Afghanistan, or it can become a source of labor for a labor-short world. Many Germans, I know, think that the Turks, they've got 3 million of them already, are great potential immigrants, and I know there are people in Hungary who think the same way. So an unintended consequence of the Ukraine war is a tectonic shift in demographics, economics, and investment, of which China is the biggest beneficiary and Russia is a secondary beneficiary. I don't think this has been absorbed by the new foreign policy team in Washington, who still talk about splitting Russia from China. This is cementing them together. We've run studies of this in Asia Times, so I'd be happy to tell you where to read more about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Randy, what's the, will there be any difference between Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0? In terms of economics, trade, energy, and so on?
First of all, regarding trade and energy, I think it's quite important to look at the wars that are currently occurring because they go hand in hand, and I believe we have to refer back to what makes things work, whether it be in China, Europe, and America, is cheap energy. If you start off with that as the key to any success with regard to trade, economics, or to resolving the situation, that was part of his plan when he kept Russia in sync in between 2016 and 2020. Was the policy for Mr. Trump was to deregulate the energy national policy, make America energy independent, cheap gas, cheap oil, and keep production costs low that way. And this way, Russia doesn't have the money to maintain its defense industry to launch a war. Afterwards, today, what we have is extremely high energy prices, which provides Russia with this amount of money for its war machine. Firstly, now going to Trump 2.0, did you see who Mr. Trump was sitting with 2-3 days ago at the UFC championship? No, maybe never. Some of you didn't pay attention, but it was the head of Aramco, who's the head of the Saudi Sovereign Investment Fund. Why did he invite the head of the Saudi Sovereign Investment Fund to sit with him? Because he is negotiating with the Saudis, probably with the main key Arab states, how they're going to deal with energy and gas and oil going forward to bring already Iran under control, bring oil prices down, how to bring Russia back under control, which is a sense going back to a similar policy that he had in between 2016 and 2020, but at the same time is bringing China also, the question is, China is getting cheap gas and cheap oil from Russia and from Iran because they're privileged partners of China. So it's going to make it more level playing field for all the players once they bring it across the board. And China has been having a competitive advantage because they were able to buy oil and cheap gas from these two countries, which gave them a competitive advantage. And as part of ours, I guess what we're saying is China's policy is overproduction. That's their key strategy, is overproduction, and how they send out all their products, of course, whether it's Europe, America. That's how they maintain it. So America's issue going forward is how are they going to be able to deal with Europe regarding China? And the key issue regarding trade is, I think, in the tech sector. You have to look, and America has been pulling, whether it be Biden, what's very interesting, or whether it be Trump. It's the American administration is closing in on tech security. It's a national security issue, whether it's semiconductors, AI, high-speed computing technology. All these are coming under control and restrictions by the Biden and will continue under the Trump administration. The Europeans, on the other hand, have been slow in adapting these new technologies. Why? It's because there hasn't been sufficient coordination between the Europeans and the Americans to establish norms within those areas where they could share economic cooperation in those key areas. There were some advances that were done in AI and semiconductors with trade and energy council that was put in place. That was with the U.S. They were able to deal with AI and with some semiconductor issues. But again, I believe going forward, the Europeans, because of lower demographics that we were saying in Europe, whether it be Germany, France, they need to turn to AI to create higher productivity. They need to turn to U.S. technology. They are behind. And that's where things are going to stand going forward, is that I believe that the Europeans and the Americans will be working together in these high-tech areas. They will be bringing down energy prices. The Americans will be providing, we can see right away, the Europeans have been saying they will buy further gas and oil from the Americans, a signal to what Trump was saying. All of a sudden, they will turn away buying less gas and oil from Russia. So you're getting strong signals about that. So that is the tendency. And there will be a tough choice to make, but I believe the Europeans will make those commitments. It's in their joint interest. And as there was being said before regarding defense, I believe NATO will be used not only to create a greater cooperation on the defensive industry, but it will be across the board for trade. Because I believe NATO will become a de facto partnership for trade purposes, because the defense industry will be the machine pushing the economy going forward, but it'll be hard choices, because the Europeans, we talked about it before, is there's a big difference on how you deal with defense in Europe. Either you're talking about joint defense on the European level and people having these joint ventures and working together to develop a joint cooperation on the military level, or what many European nations do on their own to try to get better trade deals with the Americans, they buy military equipment from the U.S. directly. And that is a difficult issue for the Europeans when they're going to be trying to develop a comprehensive and coherent defense strategy, is how are they going to deal with it on a European level, and how are they going to then focus with the U.S., which is going to push the agenda to sell military equipment from the United States and to get better trade deals, specifically on a one-to-one level with bilateral arrangements. So these are the different questions I think that we'll be facing. But many of the things that were in line that's regarding China, I think there's a certain continuity that has been done. The Biden administration kept many things, whether regarding tariffs, putting restrictions on high-tech, sensitive technologies regarding China. He'll push even further Trump, but I think these things are going to continue.
Thanks very much. Jeff.
Thanks. I think I'm going to switch a little bit from discussing the trade aspect to discussing the Trump aspect. And in terms of Trump, and if the question is the continuity, I haven't seen anything to suggest that Trump is going to reassess his policies. What I have seen is potentially a reassessment of how to implement them and really what needs to take place. Trump clearly understands the world, and now he understands Washington in a way that he may not have when he first came to Washington. He was the outsider. He remains an outsider. He remains an outsider that Washington tried very much to destroy, and he's come back with a larger mandate than he had in the first go-around. And so I think that he will be very focused on, America first. People hear that and they think that has to do with America vis-a-vis the world. It also has to do with America vis-a-vis itself and vis-a-vis Washington. And so I think that he had, in the first go-round, great policy instincts in ways that America seemed to like, but it not necessarily had the personnel in place to put those through. Most of the personnel were people from Washington. This time we see the choices he's making at top levels. We see who he's announcing first, and many of them are people who, everyone is someone who's a loyalist. It's now Trump's world in Washington. And Congress arguably may not even have to go along. It would be nice if Congress went along for him to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, but he might be able to do it even without them. In that case, really, what's he going to focus on? So he's going to focus, as we see already, on cutting down Washington. With this massive bureaucracy, that he's really, in many ways, poised to be the anti-FDR that really created a gigantic Washington bureaucracy, which in every respect he sees as his enemy and the enemies of his policy. And many Americans now, those who support him, see that as well. So in that sense, his support is huge. And when he's sort of poised to be the savior he's always seemed to imagine himself to be. He doesn't really have a re-election concern. He's able to enact transformational power without concerns for re-election. And often in Washington, you'll see a president and a vice president who differ greatly. Either the president is the political figure and the vice president is the advisor, or the vice president is some oppositional or different or complementary wing of the party or the base. In this case, there's a vice president who actually will help him enact his policies. And someone referred to him as a wingman, vice president, which is fine. So in terms of issues that he's going to confront, well, border, war, tariffs, he can do this on his own. And I'm sure we'll get to tariffs and the balance and how that's going to look in the next few years. But in this case, what I think he's focused on is he promised to drain the swamp. And in the first instance, he may have walked across that water, but he didn't make a dent in the swamp. He's come back now with enough power to certainly change the dynamic, whether it's for a short period of time or it's generational change or it's even beyond that, remains to be seen. That, I really believe, is going to be his focus. And how that impacts issues in terms of what his policies are and from 1.0 to 2.0 vis-a-vis the world, I think in future parts of the discussion, maybe I'll address that more directly. I just wanted to frame this in terms of who he is and what we're dealing with now. He does have a mandate, and he does have the power to do what he believes is necessary for to change entirely America's approach to itself and to the world.
Thanks, Jeff. Kashper, will there be continuity between Trump's first term and his current term, or his new term?
Well, I would agree that on crucial points, his policy goals will remain the same, but certainly the situation has changed. First of all, we see that Europe is more vulnerable today than it was when Trump was first president, as it has been now openly stated even in the Draghi report. Gas prices in EU are 3 to 5 times higher than in US. Electricity prices in EU are 2 to 3 times higher in the US. The European Union has been continuing the Green Deal policy, which and we see more and more protests in many countries against that, and we see how much, even though the US has its own economic problems, Europe is lagging behind America. We see increasing political and financial instability in the two biggest European countries, which are supposed to be from the 60s, the pair that should be the motto of the European Union and European integration and European sovereignty. Both in Germany and in France, we now have fragile minority governments with deep financial problems, big deficit, big debt. not a good perspective neither on the political nor on the financial level. And on the other hand, we see that Trump's team is now better organized, more coherent. He is also, as it was already mentioned, he understands governing better, since he has had both good and certainly a lot of bad experiences. And now he's selected only people who, it's a crucial difference that to all the key positions, at least for the time being, he's selected only people who have openly supported him during the campaign, which was certainly not the case 8 years ago, when he selected a lot of people who from the non-political world, like Rex Tillerson, James Mattis, etc., or John Kelly, who didn't engage politically on his side. And now he's been choosing only people who have been supportive of him during the last few years. And we see that in all his key cabinet decisions. So, and that obviously, the Republican Party and with its variants, both policymakers and politicians themselves, and the think tank analysts behind them, all of them have been trying to learn from the lessons from the not used opportunities from Trump's first term. So certainly we may see a better organized, more coherent, more decisive action now, also in terms of trade policy and imposing tariffs on a higher level, both in Europe and especially on China, but generally on all foreign countries probably. And we also see that this policy is now emboldened by the simple fact that it has to a large degree been accepted, despite all the Trump derangement syndrome, as a large part of Trump's policy have been accepted as elite consensus. For example, using tariffs has been now accepted. Protectionism has been, at least to a degree, embraced by the Biden administration. In many areas, we have seen a continuation of Trump's policy in trade. Also, we've seen that despite these 4 years without Trump and there was no honeymoon between a Democrat administration and European Union. There were a lot of tensions in terms of technological policy, despite creating new institutions like a tech council, etc. This didn't solve any problems. We have the same problems as before, and we see that they weren't solved, and the situation in both in Europe and America has deteriorated during these 4 years, with the Democrat administration losing popular mandate, and in Europe, crucial political leaders with whom Trump will now deal, having a very fragile position. It's not Merkel anymore, who has been a 4-term chancellor. Now we will have Scholz, who will be the first chancellor of Germany since the 60s not to serve a second term, and we have Macron, who has now lost his majority in both chambers, has the first minority government without a stable position in France since 1958, and we have more and more information about bad financial situation. And at the same time, we see that on one hand, EU bureaucrats will probably go down and want to double down and want to continue with policy. We've already seen a lot of articles about how Trump's election is actually an opportunity to go even deeper on Green New Deal policy, etc. And we've seen, for example, information in Wall Street Journal that European bureaucrats are planning to put tariffs on products made especially in Republican-held districts. And we will see how this will play out. But certainly, I think the situation is more favorable to Trump and his people on many levels now than 8 years ago. And the situation in Europe is less stable. And therefore, especially, which has already been discussed by all the other honourable gentlemen, with war in Ukraine, etc., with Europe's dependency on Russia, and especially in case of Germany, having its bad.
I didn't cut it off. promise.
Consequences, perhaps now we'll have to think whom did I criticize and who cut off the microphone. But finishing up, so I think that generally Trump is in a better position, both internally and externally, to conduct his trade policy and to confront China and to push his policy on Europe, and he will not be regarded as an interregnum between one liberal government and another, because obviously he's been re-elected with a much bigger support than before. So this all creates, I think, incentive for him and his team to act quite boldly, but we'll see whether they will do so.
Thank you. I want to sort of invert the question actually a bit. I mean, America is often seen as quite politically idealistic, but I think economically it's always been a very realist country. And there's a great quote from Kissinger. It says, "To be America's enemy is dangerous, but to be its friend is deadly." And I've always felt that if you look at American foreign relations in economics and trade, they've always been very much America first, it seems. Now, the question I have on this is that to what extent... I mean, obviously, we just had this election where we're very conscious of the differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. But I wonder, to what extent will there be continuity with the Biden administration, or to what extent is there discontinuity? And a part of that will be what mistakes do you think were made in terms of economics and trade and energy policy by the Biden administration that Trump could rectify or ought to rectify? In any order, go ahead.
During the first Trump administration, technology simply wasn't on the radar screen at all. By coincidence, I was in Steve Bannon's office 3 days before General Kelly fired him in 2017, I guess, summer 2017. We were talking about drafting a memo for the Defense Department to do exactly what Randy was talking about, a technology alliance to strengthen NATO. After Bannon left, there was no advocate for it at a senior level in the administration. Mattis had no interest, and there wasn't even a science advisor. Now, of course, Elon Musk is one of the great technology entrepreneurs of history, is one of Trump's closest advisors, so perhaps something different will come out of that. The one area where there certainly will be continuity with Biden is in technology restrictions on China. If anything, they'll be intensified. How effective they will be is a matter of great controversy. I think the consensus of private analysts is they'll be somewhat less effective than government people think they will be. There is a win-win and a win-lose aspect of this. Telling the Europeans we've got to buy expensive American LNG instead of cheap Russian natural gas is a win-lose approach, and I don't think that will wash. It's too expensive and too late to bring enough of it to bear. On the other hand, if the United States were to announce, for example, a Manhattan Project for thermonuclear fusion power, something which Sam Altman just put several $100 million of his own money into, I think the Europeans would be forced to sign on because they couldn't risk being left behind by the most important development in energy technology since the invention of fire. So to the extent the United States did exactly what Randy was talking about in an aggressive and win-win kind of way, I think it would have an enormously positive effect. We simply don't know enough about Trump's thinking or the thinking of people closest to him to make a prediction at this point.
Thank you. Randy.
I'll give the other side to it because we always look at the Americans' point of view, but I think, again, we need to look at the European side. Is Mr. Trump is favoring America first, which means the big tech companies, he's going to favor them. Look what they did to France when France tried to tax the big tech companies during his term. He went back to the French, well, I'm going to use retaliatory measures, and you better do away with those different taxes that you want to impose on the big tech. That might be an issue today where he's going to try to push an agenda, an America First agenda, and impose it upon the Europeans. And that will be a key issue, and the Europeans are going to be forced to accept it or not. And again, will the Europeans play a European Union game? Again, we have other issues that we haven't talked about, is that the shared competence or the shared powers between the European Union and national states, that how they deal, because the national nations, they have certain jurisdiction on trade issues, but we've given the European Union certain types of exclusive jurisdiction, whether it's about data protection and so on. These are big, big issues that have prevented the Europeans from sharing high-tech technology and moving forward, and it's been a barrier from American companies coming into Europe. And how do we resolve these issues where dealing with the data protection issues? And these are things that will need to be done and dealt with. And again, the European Union has been saying, well, we're going to be strong about it. But again, these are things that are hampering the development of investment within the European Union. To what extent are we going to be able to create an environment that's conducive to a win-win situation for U.S. industry coming back into Europe, investing, and also preventing, I forgot to say that about, we didn't talk about telecommunications. That's really, really important, is the 5G. The 5G that was put in force in the last few years across Europe, and that was to be a big issue, whether it was in the UK, of course, different countries. And the Americans have put a lot of pressure on the Europeans to abandon the 5G because it was a major security issue for them. And there are still many countries that are saying, well, we're going to be using equipment from China for 5G. And again, these are major, major issues that we're facing, and how we're going to, again, be efficient, as our dear guest was saying, to maintain these restrictions on sensitive technologies going forward, and being, again, are there going to be national security issues regarding that type of technology? We must be careful about the intentions of high-tech investments by China across Europe and the United States. Again, these create weaknesses for us. We didn't talk about intellectual property piracy, which has been a key element in a big war also during the Trump administration beforehand, and Europeans at the same time. Again, we need to reinforce those protections as they've been done, and I think we need to be really, really keen about maintaining that high on the priority list when dealing with China regarding those different issues. Again, the three issues. China does not want to abandon its overcapacity production to dump some form of dumping, which could be done across Europe and the United States. Two, they are not going to change consumer spending. In China, it was very, very important is that there was an issue. How do we deal with creating consumer spending? The Chinese do not want to change their policies regarding that, and that's going to be a major, major issue also for growth of be able to sell exports out of the United States and out of Europe toward China, which was also a policy which they've been very, very against doing. And we don't talk about it a lot during the trade deal in 2020, and there was a question of continuity, was the Chinese trade agreement. It was a two-pronged approach. There was higher tariffs, and they asked them to buy $200 billion in products from the United States. No one knows, but do you know the Chinese never complied with the purchasing of the $200 billion per year? And that was never respected by the Chinese. Even though we all talked about it was a great deal, they never complied with those provisions. So second time around, I believe that Mr. Trump will put that probably back on the table, and it'll be an issue that's going to be dealt with going forth on Trump 2.0.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, so if the question is how different it's going to be from Biden, I think we can all agree that it's going to be radically different. And frame it a little bit differently, when it comes to what's seen as the very toxic in this administration, and right now I would say also in this Congress, what's seen as a very radical, woke, leftist agenda, in America, maybe America is further radicalized on gender issues, but Europe is further radicalized on, let's say, environmental and climate and energy issues. And so I think that, and in fact, David, your slide showing with Germany, I mean, Germany is a GDP laggard. It's the first time in how long? It's more than a century? I mean, it's decades in this regard. It's wrecking economies here, and I think that Trump will have very little patience for countries that aren't willing to help themselves when it comes to this. Meanwhile, if countries in Europe don't come up to speed on issues of energy and are ignoring their own resources while America's economy is booming and Europe keeps on lagging further and further behind, that's going to have a major impact. I suspect there'll be less patience for countries who aren't willing to help themselves from the perspective that America now has. And again, it looks obvious to us that to me, that Trump believes that all available energy sources should be exploited. And that is clearly not where Europe is right now. Also, I'm going to depart again. This is maybe a little bit of a stretch in terms of priorities. And maybe this is more of a hope and a prayer than it is a clear-eyed political vision. But I think it may be true that it's been true before, but that Trump may treat countries not only through a strictly economic lens, but also through a cultural and moral lens. And certainly that embodies a lot of the wave of support that he had this time, whether it's support for his point of view or pushback against the prevailing leftist point of view that he just overcame. And that is perhaps, especially what's going on recently in Amsterdam and in Paris, and what's called now pogroms or against Jews, but also the way these countries treat their Christians, is something which I think that America is paying attention to. The dominant now American party cares about this a great deal. And in terms of the relationship between America and Europe, I think the way Europe treats its own people, its own citizens, is something that's going to be taken into consideration by the administration. In that regard, I think Hungarians seem to have one of the few leaders that actually pays attention to its own population. And I think that Trump is likely to respect that, or Trump world is likely to respect that. But I think that those are some of the factors that are going to take place that create a tremendous shift from where Biden was to where Trump will be, I would say, hopefully will be.
Casper.
Well, first of all, I think that the crucial thing that Biden is that Biden didn't deliver his main promise, which was to deliver economic stability for after supposed volatility and after COVID, because he was largely elected in 2020 because of COVID, because of how the Americans felt insecure about their future. Which and obviously the pandemic gave away Trump's main argument, which was a booming economy. But then, Biden was supposed to be a new FDR, a new LBJ, and conduct great reforms, and supposedly bring, obviously from a social democrat point of view, but bring some big reform, bring some economic accomplishments. But he didn't. In November 2020, during the previous election, even though we were in the middle of a pandemic, you had when Americans were asked in the CNN poll how do they feel about the economy, it was 49-50, so almost 50-50. And now, after 4 years, during this election, you had 33-67, so 2/3 of the country, even though you don't have such a magnificent crisis, now feel that American economy is either in a bad or very bad shape, which certainly tells you how to what extent Biden, his administration didn't deliver, despite all the Build Back Better, despite the Inflation Reduction Act, etc. And certainly his policy in terms of energy, in terms of climate, didn't age well in terms of his popular support in many states like Pennsylvania and others. And certainly Trump will now build on that in increasing gas and oil outputs, etc. And he will have a large mandate to do exactly so. And obviously this will affect all Europe and all the world. But we will see to what degree will Trump be consistent in that, because, for example, two important levels that were discussed. First, the deal with China back in 2020. To what degree will Trump actually conduct true trade deals that would to a large degree change the trade relations between America and a given country, and to what degree will he use the threat of increasing tariffs as a bargaining chip and then go for a symbolical deal which will not have that much of an actual effect, as it was with China, which then didn't act on its promises, but also with replacing NAFTA, which we didn't have really a big watering down of NAFTA premises. You just had some corrections of that. And the second level is what was discussed by my predecessor here. To what degree will his diplomacy differentiate in terms of, I would say, culture? Because this was not the case during his first term. For example, in Poland, we got an ambassador who was spent her time lecturing the Polish Conservative government about LGBT. It was her main point of interest, and she was a Trump appointee, and I think there were many such cases. So we will see to what degree will he now be consistent? Will Marco Rubio be consistent? Also, in terms of tying up, for example, different attitudes towards trade to different governments. Like, for example, here we have a Hungarian government which has a lot of close ties between Prime Minister Orban and President Trump. And to what degree, for example, will this mean that the Americans will have at least a slightly different approach in trade vis-à-vis such a friendly government? We will see.
I have one last proper question and one very short question, and we'll have to keep the answers fairly short just because I want to open it up to audience questions. But obviously the title of the panel is Towards a Sustainable Transatlantic Partnership, and a partnership involves two sides, and in this conversation I think the EU has been quite passive in this discussion. In the context of that, I just want to just lay out a few stats. So 16 years ago, the US and the EU economies were pretty much neck and neck, actually. And now the US is 50% larger. So the US GDP now is 25.5 trillion, the EU is 16.6 trillion. They were at the same level in 2008. So Europe seems to have prioritized security over growth the last 15, 16 years. The US has chosen innovation over regulation, arguably. The US has $9 trillion companies right now. The EU has 0. The biggest tech companies in Europe, like Spotify, actually moved to the States. In the US, tech founders are lauded as cultural icons. In the UK, they're called capitalist parasites quite often. 90% of EU tech talent have said they'd move to the US for the right money. EU tech salaries are 50% lower than the States, and startup funding in the US is 5 times higher than the EU. So in this context of making us for a sustainable transatlantic partnership, what can Europe do to improve that? How can they improve their relationship? How can they pull their weight in relation to the expectations of the American market?
Well, the first thing to do is to take the Greens out and banish them to some remote island in the Arctic Circle. Germany, for example, there is very strong academic research showing that Germany's got enough natural gas to, by fracking, replace all the Russian natural gas at a cheaper price, with very little environmental risk. This has been blocked by environmental ideology. So the first thing Europe could do is get rid of the woke, left-wing ideological lunacy, which has held it back. The second thing it could do is to begin to promote entrepreneurship. I would say, 20% of our American GDP is healthcare, as opposed to 10% in Europe. Europe's healthcare is better, so a lot of that is inflated, but it's certainly true that our technology entrepreneurship has been vastly superior in the information business. So Europe does have a lot of wood to chop there.
Thank you. Randy.
Again, I think there's an issue when you're dealing with the Europeans. You need to see why does investment leave Europe? Taxes. And again, I think when you look at it, it's taxes, taxes, and taxes, and any company that comes to Europe is so afraid to invest here that with the just administrative the burden that they have to set up. So firstly, I think they have to streamline, as we were saying, entrepreneurship, taxation, go across the board. Again, there have been issues in Europe too, is how do we deal with data protection. And I think data protection is a big factor. I spoke about it before in my other question, is that's a key issue of how we're doing, because America is much, much more free about it and monetizes, and that's how you create $9 trillion companies, is they monetize the data. And that's how you create the amount of money for that the capitalization of these companies in the United States is done to data. In Europe, you've restricted the use, so you cannot monetize it as much and have trillion-dollar companies as you would. So it's a simple mathematical question, and there's a simple answer from that point of view. So if you already have that viewpoint of how you deal with data as an asset, and how it's being used and overused and reused and in different ways, and that's how you capitalize in the tech industry. That cannot be done across Europe as freely as it does in the United States. So that's why we have all our high-tech companies in Europe going to the United States, firstly. Secondly, what I think is important is the problem with the Europeans. They're too linked to internationalism, and it was going to be linked before to a question you were saying, transatlantic, is that why is Trump saying, he said he was going to leave the World Health Organization, he said he's going to leave the Paris Accord. Again, you see the Europeans, they are set in a frame of mind where they have a specific treaty, they will not leave it. Even though, look at the nuclear technology, is a perfect example, as we were saying earlier, how the French and the Germans managed nuclear technology as a secondary source. The Green parties all saying now it's an acceptable alternative technology as a transition to clean energy. But that wasn't the case. That's nonsense. 20 years ago, you had them going in front of plants. They were preventing people from having nuclear energy. The French sold out on their nuclear technology. They are 85 to 90% independent 20 years ago. The Germans also were highly involved. It was only after this Fujiyama accident that the Greens took advantage of the situation in Japan to say they were unsafe to get rid of all the nuclear energy. So again, we are here of a politicized energy policy, which is anti-industry, anti-prosperity. That needs to go, and I confirm what that was being said.
Thanks, Randy. Jeff?
Sure. Short version, and you can expand this outward, drill, baby, drill. Look, this is not, what just happened now in America is genuinely a revolution. It's not a shift, it's not incremental. It remains to be seen exactly how the street reacts as there's a transition of power, but if things achieve stability, and it seems that they probably will, this change is what incrementally happened since FDR changed what America meant and how the government controlled America, the federal government. Trump is here, it seems, to roll that back entirely, to cut government massively. And America's all for that. And so we're not talking about incremental change here. And I think that we're looking at America that if we want to have a sustainable transatlantic partnership, needs to have partners here who actually are receptive to the idea that their people matter, something which, from the American right-wing point of view, we're not seeing. So there's the cultural issues. There's we haven't really spoken much about tariffs, which really probably, I think we all suspected, would have dominated this conversation. But Trump already showed us in Trump 1.0 that despite all the economic modeling which exists in a vacuum, the ability to wield tariffs, I wouldn't say surgically, but certainly more carefully than as a sledgehammer, is something that Trump knows well. The ability to wage not war through actual war, but economically is something Trump already knows how to do. He is the art of the deal. And so for Europe, and because of all the reasons stated until now, it's really going to be dependent on Europe and how it reacts to the revolution that's already taken place in America.
Thanks, Jeff. Kasper.
Well, I think the answer to your question will certainly depend whether we would mean Europe as European Union or Europe as European nations and European nation states, because I think no one would really expect a big change from the European Commission or from Madam Ursula von der Leyen. She has been, before being the president of the European Commission, she has been the minister for defense in Germany, and you know how, in what state did she leave the German army. You wouldn't expect her to bring much prosperity to Europe. And obviously, even the last 3 years since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was supposed to be a big change in the European mindset. We've had a lot of paying lip service to the idea of European defense, rebuilding European defense industry, military industry, strategic autonomy, whatever. Not much really happened. It was and it will be mostly talking. And regarding what you've gentlemen mentioned, green policy, there was some talk about, well, perhaps we should have some correction before the European Parliament election, and now it's back again to go full down on Fit for 55, Fit for 90, whatever. And the other issue is obviously how. So I wouldn't expect much change from top down, but we obviously can have a change bottom up with particular European societies, particular European nations, particular European governments seeing, especially with the Americans out, it makes even less sense to pretend that Europe will, as you would read in many established mainstream media, that perhaps no one else will do a green policy, but we will lead by example. And now the Americans, the Chinese, the Indians, they will see how we lead by example, and they will change the attitude. Though European Union is responsible for like 7% of CO2 emissions. So even if you would treat that as the most important problem, then it's absurd, blatantly absurd, to pretend that Europe will make a great change in this regard. And at the same time, this is the policy that's suffocating a lot of European prosperity, European industry. But we will see two other crucial factors. We will see how Europeans will act towards China. Because possibly with Trump introducing a lot of tariffs, you would see more Chinese goods trying to flow Europe without such big tariffs here, and how particular European countries will react. We've just seen a few weeks ago that, for example, Germany was against introducing a banning importing Chinese electrical cars, while other countries were for that. And the other big factor will be what will happen with Germany, which is obviously the biggest, most important European economic and political actor, because we see that on many levels this is the country that may be most affected in a negative sense by Trump's tariffs, because it's most dependent on exporting to US, especially its automobile industry and others. And to what degree and to how will the political situation in Germany play out with new elections, with possible Chancellor in Friedrich Merz, who will be his coalition partners, and to what degree will Germany want to actually decouple from China and from Russia, and to what degree will they just again pay lip service to this idea and actually do not want to change much?
Thanks, Kasper. Okay, so I just want to leave enough time to open it up to audience questions. So we've only got about 10 minutes if you want to stick to the schedule. Melissa, is it definitely?
I want everyone to have a
sure.
microphone.
Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes, but keep your question, please, very short. And can I ask that it's a question, not a statement? And then we can, and then their answers, keep them short as well. We'll take the two at the top quickly, please.
Hi, Phil Scotti, a former U.S. diplomat here. Could you speak a little bit about China trends? Maybe this is for David Goldman, but I defer to you all. Where are we going with China? Does it look like it's getting stronger and bigger? Demographics and so on. Thank you.
And the other one, just take two questions next to each other, and the chap next to him as well. Just take two questions.
Yeah.
Very, very short.
With the regard of Trump's personality, can he accept any partnership, a true partnership?
Okay, thank you.
I strongly recommend a report that Marco Rubio produced in September called The World China Made. There's a detailed report in it at Asia Times, but you can look it up on the web. I like it because I'm quoted in it. And Rubio argues that China has done essentially what it set out to do. It's dominated several of the world's most important high-tech industries, in which it hardly had a presence 10 years ago, and it's also dominated exports to the global south. China, in fact, now exports more to the global south than to all industrial markets together, although some of that is re-export to the United States and elsewhere. So from China's standpoint, I think they have a very long-term view. Xi Jinping's long-term plan requires 4.5% growth, compound growth, which is effectively what they have at the moment. They're not interested in Keynesian business cycles, demand stimulus, and so forth. They simply don't think that way. They're interested in dominating telecom equipment, EVs, solar panels, and a bunch of other industries. And from their standpoint, with many speed bumps, they are more or less on track. They have vulnerabilities, but they've undergone an enormous transformation in the last 5 years. Rubio's conclusion is those who believe that China will collapse of its own weight have not been borne out by facts. China will be a formidable competitor, and we need a total national effort to keep up with them.
Any other responses?
I would only amplify that, which is in the sense that China is extreme. I hesitate to say anything about China in the presence of David, but China is extremely patient in a way that the West has not shown itself to be. And so there's the short term and the long term, and I'm not sure, and David might be able to answer that, about whether they're willing to step back now briefly to see what happens in America, Trump, or what changes he wreaks in the West altogether, or they're going to pursue their ends in a more aggressive way right now.
We have to see what Trump's industrial policy is. Tariffs change the relative prices in favor of domestic producers, but we have grave shortages of skilled labor, of engineers, of capital equipment, and I think it will be more difficult, certainly than Trump discussed in the campaign, to get America's manufacturing industry back into groove than many people think.
Randy?
Just one point is when you want to bring the manufacturing, especially the high tech, it is extremely complicated and long term. You cannot look at the semiconductor industry. It takes 10 years to build a plant and make it efficient. It's not from the first day to the next that you need to put in place this type of... and there's a question of supply chain. The supply chains, look at Apple, for example. Okay, you really have to look at the industrial model of each high-tech company, where it works, how it gets, where it gets its sourcing, where it has, whether it's product, equipment, intellectual property. Look at Apple, produces most of its equipment in China. If tomorrow there was a problem, there'll be a question of bottleneck issues regarding the supply chains. If we were too aggressive with those type of policies, we would need time to bring back these industries, and these industries would require that a trade policy that would be consistent with future terms and future presidents going forth. It's not one term of Trump that can guarantee a change. So we must, hopefully, that's what I think Mr. Trump, why he chose Mr. Vance, is we want to establish at least a 12-year term of Republicans going forth with Mr. Vance, hopefully, or another person like Mr. Vance to take over and promote this type of trade policy going forward.
Okay, just take the first question, second question. Is there a third question? Anyone else got a question? Okay, these two gentlemen here, and brief questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Laszlo Balog, and former ambassador and high government official in the Ministry of Finance. My question is of economic-wise. We have spoken about trade and industry, but there is one economic element which was not mentioned. I would like to expand the horizon until the 4-year cycle of President Trump and, of course, the 5-year cycle of European Commission. We didn't speak about the economic and financial implications of Ukraine's reconstruction, which is hopefully, and in moderately optimistic terms, is in the 4-year or 5-year horizon. What would be the role, according to you, the distribution of role and share of responsibilities and share of roles, Europe, EU, where interests are obviously evident for Europe and also for the US, how do you see this perspective in a 4-year horizon? Thank you.
I think the Americans, what they've shown to be in Iraq, America is going to promote its interests and put American industry first, and they're going to put their reconstruction efforts in focus there. And I think, talking about the changes about the Europeans, I think we didn't talk about it before, but I just want to make one comment, is locally on a national level, talk about whether it'll be green parties or promoting their agenda or right-wing patriotic parties promoting agenda. It's on a national level, on national elections. Will there be a change like there was in the United States regarding leaders in those countries? Because that's where change comes from if we want change. And I want to go back to that because look at what's happening in France, and because that's where I am, is that you have similar lawfare that's being done against Mrs. Le Pen. She is probably the most prominent potential presidential future candidate going into the next elections, and they're interpreting in a different way European rules. It's a question of interpretation, and they're leading a criminal case against her, and they're trying to render her ineligible, whereas it's not like, unlike lawfare in the United States, the Constitution by its founders was done in such an intelligent way is that you cannot weaponize the justice system. In Europe, across the board, in most countries, you weaponize justice system and you prevent your adversaries from getting into the driver's seat of a country. So that's important to know, and that's what's a big issue going forward. Can the leaders, the patriotic leaders like Trump who want to promote national agendas, get the power to make change?
Okay. Actually, can I ask before we pass it on, can we just get the second question quickly in and then we can respond to both?
Yes, Tibor Lengyel, Austria and Hungary, lecturer in global governance. Incredible insight on all of your part. Thank you. My question is the Orban government's economic policy and how that ties into the prospective Trump era in economically and trade-wise speaking. I agree that Trump tries to do away with the FDR past very briefly, since I have to put it together. Exactly. Now, in Hungary, maybe we see, economically speaking, not the social conservatism, what is on my mind, but economically speaking, something very Rooseveltian. Deficit, Keynesian cycles, inflation, that are not only based on crisis, migration, war, etc., but just the basic economic advisors' philosophy in Hungary from those who surround the prime minister. Maybe Orbán Balázs would have been a better target for that question, but thank you for your answer.
When I first met Viktor Orbán 5 or 6 years ago, he said, there are people who accuse me of wanting to leave the European Union. That's nonsense. All we do is make auto parts for the Germans. Of course, he was exaggerating. Hungary's problem is that it is part of a declining economic complex. Its most important investor and trading partner, Germany, is in free fall. So there are limits to what Hungary can do. And I think Orbán's done a very good job, for example, of securing cheap energy for Hungary, securing foreign investment. Without his aggressive and inventive economic diplomacy, Hungary's economic problems would undoubtedly be far more severe than they are. That said, it's been pointed out by many commentators that Hungary's long-term issue is brain drain. Its best resource is smart people, and too many of them are recruited overseas, so finding ways to reverse the brain drain is long-term a critical thing. But in general, I think the Orbán government's policy has been inventive and very, very effective.
Any other comments on both questions? Let's not forget the first question.
I don't know that I have a specific. I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is really directly responsive to it. It's more of, since the questions are, we're all reading tea leaves here, and this is how to read these particular tea leaves, is that, it was famously said about Donald Trump originally that his antagonists or his enemies take him literally, not seriously, and his supporters take him seriously and not literally. But there's another aspect to him that I think is very important to pay attention to. And it's a word that's not usually associated with him because he's such a large character and he's such a celebrity and so not a politician. But in terms of him not being a politician, Trump, what we saw in 1.0, there was a mandate to everybody in his administration that when he made a promise, he meant to keep that promise. It's incredibly important to him that when he makes promises, those promises be kept. Now, he's less concerned, it seems, with the details of how they're kept if he has people who are loyal to him who are enacting his policies, as long as he can say, and as long as he sees that he's keeping those promises. And I think that's going to reflect in all aspects of his policy. So the best way to understand where he's going to go is to simply look at what he's been saying, because this time around, he is putting the people in place who likely will be enacting what he wants. This time around, he does have a much stronger mandate. And so it's really fairly easy to read what he's going to do and what's actually going to happen based on that.
Okay, I think that's actually all we've got time for. So I'd just like to thank the panel very much for the fascinating discussion. If you could thank the panel, and thank you very much.
The last panel of today's conference is going to be a discussion on a changing world order, featuring Balázs Orbán, a political director to the Prime Minister of Hungary, John Zagronis, full-time professor of statecraft and national security affairs at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., and Doug Stokes, professor of international security and strategy at the University of Exeter. The panel is going to be moderated by the Danube Institute's executive director, István Kis. Thank you.
Thank you. And also, all the people who are standing up, you can come down. There's still some seating here. It's more comfortable than standing upstairs, I think. Yes, especially Hungarians. So this is a discussion we wanted to do actually for almost a year now. And luckily we are able to do it now, which I'm very happy that we can do it. So first, because of the topic of the discussion, I really wanted to kind of focus on how all three of you see this changing new world order. Of course, we've been hearing a lot about this, especially since the financial crisis of 2008. The West, so to speak, has been losing its share of GDP, of economy, in the past, let's say, more than 2 decades. Still, that decline might not have been as fast as a lot of people have thought. I think, actually, America is still doing pretty well, and with Trump now, I think they will do actually even better. Of course, Europe is not necessarily doing very well, sadly. I think Europe is basically getting lost in this great power rivalry. Not necessarily this region, because I think Hungary's region, the Visegrad Group, and Central Eastern Europe has been generally doing better than Western Europe, economically speaking. But still, I think Europe has some tough decisions to make. I know that Doug has some interesting theories about what kind of multipolar world we're living today, but I will not start with him. I will start with Balázs now. The real question is, how do you see this new global... I mean, Doug, you mentioned that the liberal world order seems to be ending. It's certain that America is not the only player now. But what are we seeing now? Is this a new Cold War? Is this a multipolar world? Is this something else? How does Hungary see this, Balázs?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to be here. I'm a bit surprised by the question, because I thought we just came here to celebrate. Celebrate the changing political course at the Western Hemisphere. But if we really want to, and celebrating each other and the friendship and then the mutual understanding of the world. But if you, István, really want me to be serious, then I can recommend you my book, which is sorry, I'm still in a celebration mood, so it's hard to be serious about.
I read it, but I'm not sure everybody here.
Yeah. I also have a theory about that. Not that part, what type of world order is coming. I'm also a politician, so I usually have to give speeches not only about the past and the present, but about the future. And then in the speeches, I'm trying to reflect on a new type of logic in the world, which is not described as bipolarism or multipolarism or post-liberal world order, I try to introduce the word the age of sovereignty. This is the phrase what I like to use, but I didn't mention it in my book because I don't think it's from a scientific or academic point of view it's valid. What we can say and what I try to explain and what my hypothesis is about in my book is what is going on now and what comes from the past. So I think the old world order, it wasn't a unipolar world order. Obviously, it was unipolar, but the most important aspect of it was that it was a neoliberal idea-based world order. So neoliberalism as an ideology was dominating the discourse in politics, even in great power rivalries, in economy, in culture, in international relations, and so on and so on. And everybody, from now or to today, it's obvious for everybody this neoliberal description of the world is not valid anymore. So that kind of neoliberal structure is not existing anymore. There are some elements of it which are still there, but as a structure, it's not existing. And it's also not so special to say it because many experts share this view. But I added one additional point in my book. I think that after the COVID, and especially since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war, it became also obvious that the West, and some Western liberals, have a reaction on this changing paradigm. And they are not just realizing that the neoliberal description of the world order is over, but they want to portray they want to portray something different. And this difference is, I think, again, Francis Fukuyama is the best one of describing things. He described the word as we differentiating between democracies and autocracies. There are democracies, they are the good guys, they are on the good side of history, and there are autocracies. They are on the bad side, and they are the bad guys. And what is our choice to decide which group we want to belong to and get prepared for the upcoming future confrontation. A possible third world war, but if not a direct third world war, then economic confrontation, political confrontation, and so on and so on. So I think this is what we Hungarians call bloc formation logic. So this is the new element. This is the new reality that there are forms which are formulated based on ideological premises, and it's very logical. I'm not an American liberal, so it's not part of my job to defend their position. But I could make an explanation why they are doing this. Obviously, China is coming up. They have to focus on China, but what we see in Central, it's understandable. But what we see from a Hungarian point of view, or from many countries' point of view, or from the rest 190 countries' point of view, is the world is a bit more complex. And this bloc formation is not good in the age of sovereignty for many countries because they don't want war, they don't want confrontation, they just want mutually beneficial economic cooperation. And based on that mindset, they want to manage the transition period, which is still we are in a transition period, but these countries' goal is to manage things smoothly. So I would recommend to considering the term age of sovereignty after the age of neoliberalism, in additional thinking about whether it's reasonable to portray the world as a preparation for ultimate fights between democracies and autocracies. I think it's not a good description. It's not good for my country, so I would recommend something different for all of us.
Thank you, Balázs. Well, perhaps the third book you write could be on this concept, because I think it's interesting. I will go back to this democracy and autocracy thing, because I'm hoping that with Trump this is over. And also it was very selective picking, because you had some countries which were not necessarily democracies, while the previous Polish government or the current Hungarian government were not considered proper democracies, even though they are. But that's going to be a second question. Yes, and Egypt and a lot of others who, of course, for some reason were considered democracies, unlike let's say, Hungary. But I will give the floor now to John, if he can tell us what he thinks about the new global world order. And also, if you have any reflections on what Balázs said, please free to make them.
Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing me, inviting me to come here. If you remember a year ago, I was perhaps a bit strident, but I still hold to my comments about China going forward. But to answer your question, you mentioned Frank Fukuyama, someone I do know and who is brilliant, but I am immediately reminded of someone perhaps even more brilliant, and that's Aristotle, who spoke in his Politics about different types of regimes. And he speaks to the fact that you can have a benevolent ruler of one, a king, or you can have a tyrant, or you can have a rule of the few, an enlightened aristocracy, of the wealthy, of the educated, of the elite that overrule a regime, or you can have an oligarchy. And we want to obviously avoid a tyranny or an oligarchic form of government, or you can have an enlightened democratic, civic, educated population, or a mob. And I think we have to be mindful of that one can have different regimes that are beneficial, that take into account history and the culture of a particular region. You mentioned Saudi Arabia or the other Gulf states that are monarchies. We don't intend to alter their form of government, but to work with them and hopefully that they are benevolent kings rather than tyrants. I remember flying out of Iraq, leaving a land that had been ruled by a tyrant, going to Jordan, where there is a benevolent king who's doing the best that he can with minimal resources to help his people. So regimes matter. And something that you mentioned earlier this morning, Doug, about grand strategy, I think from the United States perspective, our grand strategy, which isn't articulated in a document, has always been, nonetheless, from Washington through, and it will be through Trump, to preserve our constitutional form of government, that we are a constitutional republic, and our policies that change across administrations reflect the times. So what are the threats to the constitutional republic of the United States during our Civil War, during World War I or World War II, where we survived victoriously and established the world order that we've all enjoyed since 45. A world order that's been based on international rule of law, that's been based on collective security, and that's been based on economic liberalization and openness. Now, I think those three pillars of a post-World War II order that we have been the architects, but not the only architects for, are in question. The international economic integration of the world is something that we pursued. We encouraged China to become a member of the World Trade Organization, to be integrated into the world economy. And we find out that, or hoped that that would lead to political liberalization of a one-party totalitarian, and I think authoritarian regime that is evil, ultimately. With respect to respecting the rights of individuals. International law is certainly under question. I know it's heavily embraced by Europeans, the notion of international law, but in practice, it is eroding. When the United States sought to go into Iraq both times, in 1991 and in 2003, we went before the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, to give our argument for why it was justifiable to go into Iraq. The Russians didn't do that when they went into Ukraine, and they're a member of the Permanent Five of the Security Council. I think they ought to be suspended. Their membership should be suspended if there were such a provision. China, we know, has the government of China. I want to be very careful. I don't want to make an argument against 1.5 billion people. It's a very rich culture, very deep culture, very historically enlightened culture. But the government is what I have a problem with. And then to get finally to collective security, of which Hungary is a member of NATO and other countries, I do see a shift or an attraction that can weaken the alliance, and that's what concerns me the most.
Okay, thank you. I know, Doug, you have a concept of shallow multipolarity. Perhaps you could talk about that a bit, and also how you see the new world order.
Thank you very much. So what I would say is I think there's multiple crises, but globalization is definitely one of them. But I don't want to. I said quite a lot this morning, and I'll echo some of my points. I think that we are now in an age of a post-liberal hegemonic age in relation to America. I think we're now in a more multipolar international system. And I think the main thing really is the cost-benefit analysis of the American state and the American foreign policy elites vis-a-vis the liberal world order. It provided enormous benefits. I don't think America has any problem with economic interdependence. In fact, I think it encourages it. So to the extent that post-war, both Germany and Japan were challenging America economically in the 1970s. I don't think it has a problem with economic competition per se. And global capitalism itself is a kind of lifts many, many boats. It's not a zero-sum game. But I think what it does have a problem with, in many ways, is the capacity for economically rich states like China and others to then leverage that economic power into regional forms of security competition. And I think it has a massive problem with that. So I think where we're at in terms of a snapshot of the international system, and there's a fantastic book by a guy called Robert Keohane called After Hegemony. And in that book, he makes the argument, we have an international institutional architecture, but absent the hegemon, what happens to that architecture? And I think that's the moment we're in now, a kind of after-hegemonic, the post-hegemonic moment. And so in a more multipolar international system, America wishes to reassess its global ground strategy away from liberal hegemony, which has had enormous costs to it in terms of the rise of other powers. So, for example, international institutions like the WTO, 2001, the whole point of the WTO was ultimately a sort of neoliberal club which had in itself a free market ideology, and yet China entered the WTO as a pretty much of a state-owned economy. So I think, and that itself then created all kinds of tensions within the global economy. It lowered inflation in the West, which was great for people, consumers, and ordinary people. But it gave China the capacity to leverage that into forms of regional security competition. So I think in terms of the shallow multipolarity, I think there are various, independently of who wins elections and the agents involved or the ideologies involved, I think states are units within a bigger structural configuration. So I think that there are a number of big structural configurations that we're going to see. I think the first major big structural configuration that's going to hit the world, and is hitting the world, is demographic decline, and the way in which that demographic decline influences things. Germany now has to import 400,000 immigrants a year just to keep its economy at the same level it currently is. That's before you put in the kind of almost suicidal energy policy that they've pursued. China also is in a real sticky place in relation to in relation to its demography. Obviously, Mao's one child policy has enormous implications now for the Chinese demography. About 1.3 billion people at the moment. By 2100, about 800 million people. 800 million people. So we're talking about a massive collapse of the Chinese population. And to the extent that China is a manufacturing nation, and that's how it's got rich, it is a manufacturing nation, what then happens to that manufacturing model in the context of a massive demographic collapse of the Han population? So you need to ask yourself that question. Same with Germany, as I say, which is really the heart of the EU. The EU really was about the constitutionalization of German power. It was primarily financially and monetary orientated in the context of the Ukraine crisis and the resolution of the Ukraine crisis, which I suspect will be wrapped up pretty quick in the next year or so. that will nonetheless leave the Russia problem. So I think that what we'll see is like the continue. Either European security will get real and will stop all the kind of fake ideas about European security cooperation, or essentially what you'll have in the European security context is fragmentation in a NATO-like environment where states will ultimately pursue their own national security policies. There'll be some degree of cooperation, but I mean, so it can go either way, fragmentation or greater cooperation. And obviously the NATO-like framework will overdetermine that. So I think that the concept of shallow multipolarity essentially refers to this idea that we are in a multipolar international system, but to the extent to which China is a pole around which that can be organized, I think there are very significant structural trends that portend quite potentially a very significant Chinese decline going forward. So what I think would be this: I think that the liberal hegemonic moment is now over. I think we're entering into a period now of what I've called sovereign internationalism. I was inspired by Bolash's book, which is fantastic, by the way. He doesn't know this, but I spent the summer in his mind reading his work, and we've got a great piece coming out in Hungarian Conservatives soon. So we get the book. I'm sure it's available in all very good bookstores. It's a fantastic book. So I think that's where we're going. So essentially, I think that's where we're going in terms of kind of more of a shallow. And the final point I make is this: I think at the moment, what America's doing is going to end up in a really good place. If we think about what are the structural drivers of prosperity and economic growth, etc., it really comes down to basic fundamentals, common sense fundamentals. And the first one is energy. America has huge amounts of energy. America will continue to remain at the heart of global alliance systems, security systems. Militarily, and this is a very important point, military power isn't just about the use of kinetic power. It's not about just winning wars or fighting wars or having deterrence. Military power, in my opinion, is primarily about leveraging that military power to structure the preferences of other states, friends and enemies alike. If you're in a security alliance with America, America gets incredible veto power and leverage over your domestic and international foreign policy preferences. That's why I think that America will remain extraordinarily strong, and all the big cutting-edge aspects of future capitalism, AI in particular, are highly energy intensive. So what Germany's done is so stupid, because AI is the future in many ways, computing is the future, and it's super energy intensive. So to sort of give that up, so where the EU's going, I'll shut up in a minute, but where the EU's going is this: it's going down some weird, statist, almost quasi-socialist road of virtue signalling and essentially giving up on any form of leadership, and it'd rather sit in the parliament and yip yap rather than do anything concrete, whereas America is building the future. So I think that's where we are. Anyway.
Thank you, Doug. I think there was a very British opinion on the European Union, which sadly I partly share. But I think John wants to make a remark here.
Yeah, I did, because I'm reminded, and I too read your book, the concept of connectivity, which I think is insightful and it's useful. But I caution anyone when one examines connectivity to ask, what are the consequences of connectivity or any form of engagement, and how might one be captured by the attraction to a particular pole? I remember now why I was so strident a year ago was because of the comment that basically there are two suns in the sky, and smaller countries have to be careful about orbiting too close to one of the suns, a euphemism for the United States and China. And I just fundamentally disagree with this moral relativism that we are two similar suns. We're not. And nor do I believe in the balance of power, which I think the Reagan administration was right to recognize, to free up people from Eastern Europe, to say that, yes, for a balance of power, which is a very Kissingerian concept, maybe it made sense for the time, but the Reagan administration came in to say there's something inherently wrong or evil about subjecting half the world's population to one form of regime versus another. So I do believe that there are consequences to connectivity. We are recognizing them in the United States with our relationships with China, our relationship with China over the years, where we did expect economic engagement would lead to more of a liberal openness of their political regime, and we know that that was never in the cards of the Chinese leadership. I encourage all of you to read a very short monograph by a Chinese defector who was an educator at one of the leading Chinese party schools to educate up-and-coming political leaders in China of the teachings of Mao and Deng Xiaoping and now Xi Jinping, where she said, basically, we all thank you for your investment in China and bringing us up from an agrarian and then a very basic industrial society into a modern society, but we never believed in, and we're never going to accept a political challenge to the party that every administration from Nixon up until Trump had pursued. I participated in a number of meetings when I was on the National Security Council, the White House, and the Bush administration, and we wanted to continue to engage with China, but manage the relationship a bit more effectively, and thought that continued economic opportunities that we could offer China would liberalize their political system, and we come to realize, and it was really Trump in his first term that recognized that, all right, that's not going to happen, and we have to face the imbalances of the trade arrangements that we've made, and we're going to correct for them. I know that there is, and we too welcomed the election of Trump. There is a close affinity, apparently, not even apparently, with President Trump and Prime Minister Orban that I think will do well for U.S.-Hungarian relations. But there will be a little bit of a fly in the ointment, and that is Hungary's policies toward China, where this administration, the new Trump administration, is going to be more hawkish than certainly the Biden administration was. Because it is a challenge to the world order that, yes, it was in America's interest to establish collective security, promote rule of law. We were one of the principal architects of the United Nations Charter in Bretton Woods and the economic structure that we have today. And all three of those pillars are being challenged. And when friends or allies begin to question that's a problem that we recognize and have to address.
Okay, thank you. Balaji, would like to comment on this, or I have some questions. So,
of course, first to Doug, that it was a nice statement, but you didn't mention UK, which is also not fair. How it fits into the story. I think here in the room is always. Everybody is with you if you keep mentioning Germany and the Europeans and in that way. But what about UK? Unfortunately, this is also an important question or an interesting question intellectually. What was mentioned by John? So it's like, who am I to give advices to any American foreign policy administration? I'm just a friend, a Central European expert who like the Americans, and I know how people, when Americans are not in the room, are talking about Americans. So
we know too.
Yeah, let's hope CIA is doing its the best part of a very good part of the job. But if I can imagine that there are some places where the CIA is not there, and still there are interesting conversations. United States of America is, I think everybody in Europe has a positive affiliation towards United States because what they did in the Cold War period of time, how they helped us. How they won the Cold War and actually caused the collapse of the Soviet Union at first, and second, how they helped the anti-communist movements here in Hungary, but also, and I think for us in Central Europe, this was the most important element, how they showed an alternative for the reality where we were living in. So we Hungarians and the Czechs and the Poles and all other countries, they could see America as a free and prosperous country. Meanwhile, they realize that their country is not that, and they wanted to have that country, and they wanted to join to that type of people. So I think the driving force behind the European nation and American nation, democracy, rule of law, freedom, prosperity, it's very similar. What happened after? The Soviet Union collapsed. NATO came in. We are very thankful to NATO cooperation because this is providing security for the countries who are in the region. It's very important. And I'm also having a pro-American position on that, so I understand why our American friends are asking from the Europeans to do more, because if you want to guarantee your own security, why should I pay for it? Why should I be the only one to pay for it? You should take your part of the job as well. So I was always saying in the election campaign that everything which is said by President Trump is actually a pro-European statement. He doesn't see it that way, because he sees it as a pro-American statement, but in the same time, it's also a pro-European statement, because it encourages European leaders to take more responsibility on their own defense, which means more sovereignty on the security-related areas for Europeans. So now, Europe has no independent voice on the Russian-Ukrainian war, although it's obvious that Europe's security interest in the Russian-Ukrainian war would be different than American security interest, but Europe cannot have an independent voice. Why? We are 100% dependent on American security. And the American liberal administration, based on President Biden, was pushing the agenda and forcing the agenda on the Europeans. Not all Europeans, because the Eastern Europeans share their way of understanding of the conflict. But we Central Europeans, we don't see it that way, and also the Germans and the French. At the beginning, they had a different understanding, but they couldn't represent their own interests. They had to change and go to an autopilot following mode with the American position. And what else is happening? The American liberal administration is coming to our country. We have a wonderful ambassador, Ambassador Pressman, probably the last days of him, and here in the country. And what he is saying, he is telling us to change 100% completely our positions in the war, in the migration, in the gender policies, in the China, in the European, in the trade wars, and everything. And when Hillary Clinton was the state secretary, she sent Victoria Nuland to our foreign ministry, and she put a paper at the desk of the foreign minister, and she was saying that if you want to make good friendship with the United States, you have to change the constitution, in your constitution, in these 11 points. If you are not doing this, we are not going to be good friends. And those were all like liberal policies. Obviously, they were criticizing the conservative elements of the Hungarian constitution. So, John, the only reflection on what you were saying, it's when you ask the Hungarians whether they want to live in a free and fair and prosperous and democracy-based society, their answer would be obviously yes. They want a model of governance like this, and they were fighting for like 1,000 years. But the question, how we should deal with great powers and how great powers are respecting your right and respecting your sovereignty, and what they want to impose on you and what they don't want to impose on you, the question is not so black and white. So, and what I keep telling to my American friends that, look, if you are not in the room, some people are criticizing this aspect of American foreign policy. And some people are saying that, okay, obviously no one wants to live in the world where the political structure is managed either by the Indians or by the Chinese or by the Indonesians or by the Russians, definitely not. But they are not coming with this kind of papers. They are coming with offers, what you can accept or decline. And like for a small country, and compared to U.S.-China rivalry, all 190 other countries are small countries. For them, sovereignty is always about no dependency, independence in choosing in the policy era. So in the field of energy, this is why it was not only a suicide plan from the economic competitiveness point of view, but also from an energy sovereignty point of view, saying no to Russian gas and oil from a sovereignty point of view was a big mistake from Europe, because we don't have our energy resources. The Gulf states they have, the Americans they have, the Chinese they can get. But we also have to get it from somewhere. So if we declare from political reasons to say no to energy cooperation with the Russians, it means that we are limiting our market and we bring up the prices. And we are going to be more dependent than before. So if you are a national conservative, a sovereignty-based somebody, it's not about ideas, it's not about moral, it's not about who is... It's a different type of moral, because your moral responsibility is to have the best for your own people. And the best for your own people, if they get through secured and safe channels, in a cheap price, the energy. And if you say no to that because somebody asked from you to do so, and you are forced to do so because you are not strong enough to defend your own position, then you are not a sovereign nation. And then you are not a good national conservative, because you are not fighting for your people. You are just an advocate of somebody else. So this is our problem now, and this is why I try to explain it to all American friends that in this new world order, if there are strong countries, obviously national interests will always be different. They should be different, because the history, the geography, the economic status, and many things are different. The question, how we deal with each other, and we have to invent and come up with a new mindset, with a new way of understanding. Otherwise, the decline of the West in general, decline of all our powers in general, compared to the rest of the world, will continue. And we were not able to stop it. So this is my only very polite recommendation for everyone who is somehow thinking about the future of the Western world and how we should manage the new type of international reality around us. Thank you.
Thank you, Balázs. Before I give you the floor, John, I want to sneak in a question, but I think Balázs mentioned a very important fact which a lot of people might not know here. I'm not sure that you have any other capital in the world which has 2 statues of American presidents. Yes. Budapest has, so I think that clearly shows our commitment and appreciation to America. Now, Balázs mentioned the bloc mentality and the Biden administration. Well, hopefully that will never happen. Perhaps Trump. I mean, I'm more in favor of that.
The Statue of Liberty to change it.
Yeah. But to stay partly with the topic, Balázs mentioned this partly, and you talked about perhaps some problems with the security architecture and how you will kind of bring different kind of people together. And I think Balázs touched upon a very important fact, which I think Democrats usually make as a mistake, and which has been a part of American foreign policy in actually even during the Trump administration as well, because he couldn't really change people, and that is this very progressive idea which is pushed by your embassies. And that's something which, when I'm traveling from Singapore to India to Morocco, this comes up in the first half an hour. So a lot of the people who actually would be friendly to America or in favor of America talk about how their embassy there, American embassy there, is pushing some of these policies. And because they know Hungary is a conservative country, they know they're a NATO member, this comes up quite frequently. What is Hungary doing with this? How can you manage your cooperation with America as a conservative country when you're getting this pushback on, let's say, LGBTQ rights, trans rights, stuff like that? So the question really here is, do you think this will change with the new, I'm hoping it will, and looking at some of the people Trump is suggesting, I think it's going to change, because I think, if anything, this will actually lead to a more peaceful world, because he will be a bit more realist, and also look at more as a security alliance and less as a alliance of, shared values, which sometimes even Americans don't share, because I'm not sure transsexual rights is something which, and if you look at the election results, I think most likely most Americans don't share. Still, your State Department has been pushing it. So you're welcome to make the remarks, but I also wanted to put in this question, because I think, and also going back to the celebrating Trump, I think this is going to help America, because now I think, frankly, you are losing some allies or potential allies because of these policies from the State Department.
Well, that's why I'm glad this is a conversation and not a debate, because I honestly, when we talked about this before, there's much that I agree with that Balázs has said or that was presented earlier, and I'm saddened that you brought up two examples that I would agree with you. The pressure from the current administration for very intrusive, having someone rewrite their constitution is not the role of a diplomat, nor is promoting certain social norms. Yes, as part of American respect for human rights and how people's sexual tendencies are treated as human rights is more of an American. I think first we have to address it before we start to proselytize throughout the world. I consider myself a pragmatic idealist. There are ideals to aspire to, but to be more pragmatic about how to achieve them. And my only, it's more than a disagreement. I recognize that from outside looking at the United States, we are very inconsistent in our policies, because our political system of late, if you just think of the transition from Bush to Clinton, to Bush, to Obama, to Trump, to Biden, back to Trump again. We're swinging back and forth, and it's hard to be consistent in policies. So each administration pursues what they think to be most important to them for the moment that they're in power, rather than a long-standing bipartisan across different administrations policy that is increasingly difficult to achieve. And if from a United States perspective, if we don't have that consistency and that clarity of policy, we're not going to get consensus in the American public. Now, we have a moment in time in history right now where the president has been elected. He had a significant majority of the Electoral College. He had a large portion of the popular vote, so that was not in dispute. We now have a Senate and a House of Representatives that are also Republicans, so we are likely to see some movement in policy that I think in the right direction that will address the challenges to the world order. I don't believe it's appropriate to intercede in the internal workings of a country. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, Balázs. I'm just concerned about the way that the world order, as we in the West have enjoyed since World War II, is potentially eroding, and what some of the members of the Western world order are doing to either accelerate or to not strengthen that world order. International law, economic engagement, and collective security. Every country certainly has the right to its sovereign aspirations, but when one does join an international body, whether it's the EU or NATO or the UN, you are obligated then to the terms of those agreements. And from an American perspective, and not, Hungary, fortunately, for this conversation, has exceeded its economic contribution to NATO funding. Americans, we are very practical people. Sometimes people might think of us as naive. I don't think we're as naive as we appear. But we're very, very practical. And Americans have our own issues. We have illegal immigration. It's not that we're opposed to migration or immigration, but we are opposed to the illegal swarming in of our country and then assuming all kinds of rights and responsibilities that are inherently given to citizens. We have to focus on our economy. We've done some really, from my perspective, odd policies with respect to going green. All right, so electric vehicles. All right, you don't want to you want to contribute to a green environment and replace fossil fuels. Okay, where are we going to get those batteries? Well, they're made in China. What do batteries require? They require lithium. Well, we don't produce lithium anymore, nor batteries. So now we become dependent in the connectivity of our economic pursuits of a green environment when we are energy independent. So we shoot ourselves in the foot. So I am sympathetic to your criticism of the intrusion on your sovereignty and others, and it's really not our place to do so.
I think President Trump, in a campaign, I was in Arizona and I kept him speaking. He described it. I was surprised how nuanced he described this, what you just said. So America has energy independence. But if you change too fast to EVs, then it means you are getting more dependent. So if you are national sovereignties, it's not your way. I wouldn't do anything else. I'm just saying that the Hungarian point of view is different because we don't have energy resources and we have a car manufacturing industry, actually a quite developed one. And because of the German suicide mission, what is going on now, the German car manufacturing producers are not doing great, and they don't have a chance to be leading ones in the EV industry. So what we are doing, somebody is coming and asking for bringing production and know-how and joint ventures here. And we say yes, because it means more survival, more sovereignty, and more independence from our economy point of view.
No disagreement.
So it's a same coin, but a different side.
I also think it's important that we seek opportunities to collaborate even more closely. We were talking before this panel, the Balkans, for example, where Hungary has a substantial historical presence and interest in the region, where we could collaborate much more closely, and rather than find opportunities to distance ourselves from each other, where can we partner and strengthen the relationship? And that's really the role of diplomats, to find out those opportunities to engage, not to penetrate the society of all these countries. I served in the Bush administration where transformational diplomacy was the buzzword, to transform promote democracy in countries around the world. Yes, a noble cause, but our diplomats are not trained to go into a country and help to transform that regime. Diplomats are there to represent the United States, to negotiate on behalf of the United States, and report back to Washington what's happening in the country, not to change the regime. And I would believe, I think, knowing what little I do about Rubio and some of these other nominated cabinet officials, they will not be so intrusive into the regime itself, but how the relationship either improves or not with the United States at a more traditional manner. And I think that's a good thing.
That is what we're hoping as well. I think this will have to be the last question. There was a lot of talk before the first Trump presidency. A lot of the liberals, especially here in Europe, were afraid that Trump actually means a more dangerous world. I think that was proven wrong because the world was much more peaceful during Trump than it is now. But my last question will be to all of the panelists, and I will start with Doug because he didn't have the chance now to reflect on some of these things. You can reflect as well. But my question is, how do you see the conflicts in Ukraine and Israel under Trump administration? What will be the solution here? We're of course hoping that in both cases we can move to a more peaceful world.
Well, so Well, there's a massive set of questions there. I'll do my best to answer those. I think that. Thank you very much. I think on Ukraine, I suspect something will get wrapped up pretty quick. I said this morning. I don't think Trump will have indefinite patience with the Russians. I think he'll want to get a deal done fairly quickly. I don't think it will look that different to the 2022 deal that was already on the cards. Obviously, at the moment now, we're in a funny period where both sides, and especially the Russians, are going to push hard to increase their negotiating leverage when it comes to the negotiating table vis-à-vis territory. And obviously, Biden's green light for the attacks on Russian sovereign soil is a kind of last hurrah. It's like a FU to Trump and to whatever. So I think we're. But
by the way, do you see that as a danger? And that's a question to John as well, because a lot of people here are afraid that actually Biden will escalate the conflict before Trump can come in.
My personal take on that, and I could be completely wrong, I don't think it's a danger, because I think Putin will basically not be obviously extraordinarily unhappy about it, but I think he'll think to himself, look, I've only got to wait a bit longer till January. This idiot's gone, and then I got Trump, and then we can work something out. So if he had done this in 6 months ago or whatever, I think we'd have been a very different conversation. So I think Putin, as a strategist, will see what it is and will wait. And so I think Ukraine will get wrapped up fairly quickly, and then I think the big question is, in a kind of more of American light NATO European security architecture, what then do the Europeans do? Do they go for the fragmentation thing, or do they go for the kind of the greater cooperation? I suspect it'll be a mishmash of both, and it'll be an absolute disaster. But that's another story. On Israel, again, I said a bit this morning. I think the conditions of possibility for the Middle East at the moment are the Abraham Accords, and obviously when Sinwar, the former leader of Hamas, who is now been taken out, activated the October 7th thing. I think it was a massive miscalculation. My opinion is Hamas is done. Hezbollah is getting done. I think Iran is in a much, much tighter spot than it was a couple of years ago. I think a couple of years ago it thought it had its proxies, meat shield type thing. I think that looks very different now. As I also said this morning, I think Israel and the Americans, Israel can take out a lot of Iranian infrastructure very, very quickly. And the strikes on the S-300s that Israel carried out in response to the hypersonic attacks have shown that. It's got complete air superiority over Iran. So strangely enough, this is going to sound extraordinarily weird to the audience, right? But I'm actually quite optimistic about the long-term prospects for peace in the Middle East because of the Abraham Accords. Essentially, the Gulf states now see the future. The future is a post-fossil fuel future, and it will be on much deeper technological and economic interdependence with Israel as part of that. Turkey, we have not yet talked about Turkey. Turkey will also emerge as a very, very important state in this new dispensation. So, and I think that Iran is in a very fragile space. If it's whacked a bit, and if it goes for the Gulf states in terms of missile attacks or whatever, then that's a very, very dangerous thing. But we don't know with Trump in terms of Iran. He may give a green light to greater Israeli strikes on Iran. He may not. He may seek to try and do a deal. It's a strange one. So my long-term prognosis for the Middle East is I think the Abraham Accords are really the conditions of possibility. The Gulf states have been aligned in a really useful way with a broader Israel reordering project that we're seeing go. And they have a very strong path dependency and incentive into the success of that. They're very happy about Iran getting whacked. They've feared the Shia crescent for many decades. So what Israel is doing is actually in their national security interests. So I think that creates the conditions of possibility for a broader regional reconfiguration.
Thank you, Doug, and also thank you for bringing in Turkey, because I think that's again something, and the Turkic states in general, where Hungary and America can do more together. Luckily, Hungary has a very good relationship. It's an observer in the Turkic States Council, so that's also something I think where we share some interest with America. But I will give the floor to John.
Well, Michelle said something earlier this morning that I definitely agree with. Trump is a surprise. He's provocative. He's unpredictable, and that is a strength and a conundrum as well. He's also very transactional. It's not that he's not strategic, but I think he from his first term, and I think what he's said in his rhetoric and why he's so appealing to a lot of the American public is because he identifies a problem and then he offers a solution. And he will look at Ukraine and he wants peace. He probably wants the Nobel Peace Prize for arranging a peace arrangement in Ukraine. The question, though, is under what terms? Is it land for peace? Are there going to be some security guarantees for Ukraine? Is there going to be some quid pro quo with Russia that Ukraine will not join NATO, but they'll be like Austria after the Second World War? What about reparations? Is Russia going to have to pay for the atrocious damage that they've done to Ukraine? Those I don't know, but I think he will pursue an end to the conflict there, at least temporarily. In Israel, he's going to be a friend of Israel, there's no question. And I think he will further pressure the Iranian regime and makes no qualms about going after people like Soleimani, the former leader of the Quds Force. So from an Israeli perspective, I think that's a good thing. But we'll see.
Thank you. And last but not least, Bonaj.
So I do think that we are in a very dangerous situation. I don't know. I mean, I think that the decisions of the American administration are dangerous in a sense that it leads us towards the further spiral of escalation, which actually shouldn't be the case if there is an elected president who representing a completely different view. But that's another story. And there is one element which is sometimes underestimated by the Americans because they are control of the management of the war from the Western side, and they think that they are able to control everything, which is quite logical. But the strategy of the Ukrainians and some Europeans, and they want to go to war, and they want to keep the war continue. And if you are try to think with their head, it's obvious that their strategy in this 2 months period of time should be to escalate the conflict, to drag the Westerners as much as they can get into the war, to limit the maneuvering space for a transactional deal for Trump. And sorry, I'm not working from any Secret Service agency playbook. It's like common sense. I would do the same. But I'm a Hungarian, and I'm on the other side of the story because we are afraid of this escalation, and we don't want to go into the war. We think it's a war of two Slavic nations, and we want to work on that very hard, how to make peace. But this 2 months transition period of time, I think it's very, unfortunately, it's very dangerous. Not just because of the intention of the Biden administration, that's one element. The other element is the intention of those who are already into that war. And the Middle East is very, very much complicated. As you see, Hungary has, I can say, traditionally is one of the closest allies of Israel in Europe. So we think that they have the right to defend themselves. But also Hungary is having very good relationship with all the Arab countries, and in this conflict we are not, again, a decisive factor, but we could make some diplomacy by maintaining the relationship with both sides, and we could help to avoid some kind of unnecessary escalation. For us, a direct confrontation between two states in the Middle East would be a disastrous thing. So we also, in the same time, we accept the right of Israel to defend itself, but also we are always encouraging everybody to take into consideration not letting this situation go into a full-scale or turn into a full-scale war. And I agree with you that there are some other very important players as well in the Middle East in this new changing world order. Their importance will grow. The Gulf states, also Egypt, and for us, Hungarians, most importantly, obviously Turkey. And the Turkish states, for many reasons and from many areas, Hungary and Turkey has a strategic partnership, and we want to work it on actually very hard. I don't know how many times President Erdogan and Prime Minister Orban met in the last 5 years. Minimum 5 times, but probably, I think even more, 10 times, because if you count the Turkish Council meeting as well, I had to make the calculation. But it's a very intensive and very good cooperation, and we are very proud of it. And we think that Turkey should be not integrated, but kept into the European discussion, because it's in this age of sovereignty, this is definitely a key country, and European politicians should have a special, build up a special relationship with Turkey. They were here last week or a week before at the European Political Community meeting, which was an important sign for us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's an important point, and also something which, again, could be useful for American friends, because Hungary has never been a colonizer. It was part of the communist bloc, so we have traditionally, I mean, this is not necessarily completely unique to Hungary. It could be partly due to Poland or other countries, but we have quite good relationships with the so-called third world, in Africa, in the Middle East, which is, I think, something which in the future could help our American friends as well, the insight we have in these regions, and they might talk to us more frankly than to you guys. I'm not sure if, John, you want to make a remark or not. You were looking at me. It's just, okay. So if that's the case, I would like to thank you. I think we had a very good discussion between friends. We aired out some things, but in the end we could say that we I think leave as good as friends as we've been before. I think it's very important to have these kind of discussions, and of course the Danube Institute is committed to have them. I think it's good to talk and learn from each other. So thank you very much for the panelists, Balázs, John, Doug, for being here. I would also like to thank our audience for being with us for the whole conference. I hope you had a good time. Thank you very much and wish you a nice day.